What you're about to witness will completely shatter everything you think you know about love, money, and destiny. A single father barely scraping by bought a $3 coffee for a crying stranger in a small-town cafe. He thought he was just showing basic human kindness. What he had absolutely no idea about, she was the most powerful billionaire investor in the entire country, worth over $2 billion. And this one simple act of compassion was about to trigger a chain of events that would make international headlines, destroy career, build empires, and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the most ordinary moments. Before we dive headfirst into this absolutely mind-blowing true story that reads like something straight out of Hollywood, I need you to smash that subscribe button right now. Seriously, hit it. And drop a comment telling me exactly where in the world you're watching from. Because what happens next is going to leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about fate, love, and the power of a single moment to change two lives forever. Picture this. It's 6:47 a.m. on a bone-chillingly cold Wednesday morning in the small town of Cedar Valley. The kind of morning where your breath creates clouds thick enough to write your name in, where frost clings to every surface like nature's own crystal artwork, and where the only sounds breaking the silence are the distant hum of early commuters and the gentle chime of a cafe door opening and closing. Inside Murphy's Corner Cafe, tucked away on the quietest street in town, sat a woman who looked like she carried the weight of the entire world on her shoulders. Her name was Isabella Martinez, though nobody in that cafe knew it at the time. She wore an expensive charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, but somehow it looked wrinkled, tired, defeated. Like even the finest materials couldn't armor her against whatever storm was raging inside her heart. Isabella wasn't scrolling endlessly through her phone like everyone else in the digital age. She wasn't pretending to read a book or newspaper to avoid eye contact with strangers. She was just sitting there completely still, staring into a half-empty ceramic mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The surface had developed that telltale film that comes when coffee sits untouched for too long, forgotten and neglected, much like Isabella felt in that moment. And the tears, they weren't the dramatic, attention-seeking kind you see in movies. These were silent, private tears that slipped down her cheeks so quietly you'd think even she didn't know they were falling. The kind of tears that come from a place so deep, so raw, that they bypass all your defenses and just escape. That's when Marcus Thompson walked through that squeaky cafe door, bringing with him a burst of cold air and the scent of motor oil that never quite washes out no matter how hard you scrub. Marcus was 36 years old, a single father who'd been weathering life's storms for the past 4 years, since his wife Sarah had lost her battle with breast cancer. He worked as a mechanic at Patterson's Auto Repair, spending his days elbow-deep in engine problems, trying to fix everyone else's transportation troubles, while his own 15-year-old Honda Accord held together through sheer willpower and strategic applications of duct tape. This particular morning followed his usual routine with military precision. Drop his 7-year-old daughter Lily at Sunshine Elementary School, where she'd wave goodbye with gap-toothed enthusiasm before running to join her friends on the playground. Then swing by Murphy's Corner Cafe for his daily fuel black coffee with just a splash of cream and a hot chocolate with extra marshmallows for Lily, who was currently curled up in the backseat of his car, still half asleep and clutching her stuffed elephant like a lifeline. Marcus had learned to keep his head down, mind his own business, and focus on the simple task of surviving each day. Life had taught him harsh lessons about getting involved in other people's drama. Everyone you meet is fighting battles you can't see, carrying burdens you can't understand, and the kindest thing you can do is give them space to breathe. But something about Isabella drew his attention like a magnet. Maybe it was the way she sat so perfectly still while chaos swirled around her. Maybe it was the expensive coat that contrasted sharply with her obvious emotional devastation. Maybe it was simply the recognition that comes when one broken soul recognizes another. Marcus found himself studying her reflection in the cafe window as he waited for his order. Her dark hair was pulled back in what had probably started as a neat ponytail, but had slowly unraveled throughout what was clearly a very long night. Her hands remained motionless on either side of her coffee cup, not warming themselves on the ceramic, not reaching for sugar or cream, just existing in space. The tears continued their silent journey down her face, and Marcus felt something twist in his chest. It reminded him of those terrible months after Sarah's diagnosis, when he'd sit in hospital waiting rooms, trying to hold himself together while his entire world crumbled around him. The loneliness of carrying the grief that feels too big for your body, too complex for words, too personal to share with strangers. His coffee order was ready, steam rising from both cups like tiny prayers ascending to heaven. Marcus thanked Jenny, the morning barista who'd been working at Murphy's since before time began, and turned to leave. He'd made it exactly 3 steps toward the door when something stopped him cold. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Without overthinking it, without analyzing the potential consequences or social implications, Marcus turned back to the counter. "Jenny, could you add another coffee to my order? Medium extra cream, no sugar." Jenny raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Small-town baristas develop an intuitive understanding of when to pry and when to simply fulfill requests without commentary. When the third coffee was ready, Marcus walked slowly across the cafe, his work boots silent on the worn wooden floors. He approached Isabella's table with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space and gently placed the fresh steaming cup on the scratched wooden surface in front of her. "Thought you might need a refill," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hope your morning turns around." Isabella's head lifted slowly as if emerging from underwater. Her eyes were the color of dark chocolate rimmed with tears, but sharp with intelligence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither of them spoke. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe itself recognized the significance of this seemingly simple exchange. "You didn't have to do that," Isabella whispered, her voice hoarse from emotion. "I know," Marcus replied with a gentle smile that reached his eyes. "But I wanted to." She blinked once, twice, like someone trying to refocus a camera lens. As if kindness without expectation was a foreign concept she needed time to process and understand. "Thank you," she managed, her fingers finally moving to wrap around the warm ceramic mug like it was a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Marcus gave her a small, respectful nod and turned to leave, not wanting to intrude any further on her private moment of pain. He understood the kind of silence she was sitting in, the kind that wraps tight around your ribs and makes words feel like sharp edges cutting your throat. Sometimes the only thing that helps isn't conversation or advice or well-meaning platitudes. Sometimes all you need is knowing that someone noticed you, that you're not completely invisible in a world that often feels indifferent to individual suffering. As Marcus walked back to his car, coffee growing cold in his hands, he had no earthly idea that he'd just performed an act of kindness for one of the most powerful women in the entire country. He didn't know that Isabella Martinez controlled a business empire that spanned continents, employed thousands of people, and had the power to influence national economic policies with a single phone call. All he knew was that he'd seen someone in pain, and he'd done the only thing he could think of to help. In that moment, Marcus Thompson was just a mechanic who believed in treating people with basic human decency. But Isabella Martinez, she was something else entirely. Let me tell you exactly who Marcus Thompson really was, beyond the grease-stained work clothes and calloused hands that spoke of years spent wrestling with stubborn machinery. This was a man who'd been forged in the fire of unimaginable loss, tempered by responsibility, and shaped by the kind of love that only comes from being solely responsible for another human being's entire world. 4 years, 3 months and 16 days earlier, Marcus had been a completely different person. He'd been half of a partnership, part of a team. A husband who came home every evening to a house filled with laughter, dinner conversations, and plans for the future. Sarah Thompson had been his college sweetheart, the kind of woman who could make friends with a brick wall and somehow convince it to smile back. She'd been a kindergarten teacher with an infectious laugh and an unwavering belief that her husband could achieve anything he set his mind to. Sarah had been the dreamer in their relationship. While Marcus was content working for Patterson's Auto Repair, earning a steady if modest paycheck, Sarah would spend evenings at their kitchen table with business magazines spread out like battle plans. She'd circle articles about small business loans, highlight success stories of mechanics who'd opened their own shops, and fill notebook after notebook with ideas, floor plans, and financial projections. "You're too good to work for someone else forever," she'd tell him, pregnant belly round, with the promise of their future daughter. "You have gifts, Marcus. You understand engines the way Mozart understood music. People need honest mechanics, and you're the most honest man I know." Those conversations felt like they'd happened in someone else's life now. Cancer had swept through their world like a tornado, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. 18 months from diagnosis to funeral, during which Marcus had watched the strongest person he had ever known fight a battle she couldn't win, with grace, courage, and an optimism that never wavered, even when her hair fell out, even when she couldn't keep food down, even when the doctors ran out of treatment options. The day Sarah died, Marcus felt like someone had reached into his chest and ripped out everything that made him human. But he couldn't fall apart, couldn't curl up in a ball and surrender to grief, because 3-year-old Lily needed him to be everything her mother had been. Strong, consistent, loving, present. So he'd buried his dreams, along with his wife, and focused on the simple, overwhelming task of keeping a tiny human alive, healthy, and as happy as possible. Now, every morning was a carefully choreographed dance of survival. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., start coffee, wake Lily with gentle tickles and silly voices, help her choose clothes that sort of matched braid her hair while she ate cereal, and watch cartoons, pack her lunch with a hand-drawn note, because Sarah used to do that, and some traditions are too precious to abandon. Drop Lily at school with kisses and promises to pick her up early if she had a bad day. Drive to Patterson's Auto Repair in a car that made concerning noises but somehow kept running. Spend 8 hours diagnosing problems, replacing parts, explaining repair costs to customers who often couldn't afford them, but desperately needed their cars to get to jobs that barely paid enough to survive. Pick Lily up from after-school care help with homework that was already more challenging than he remembered. From his own childhood, make dinner from whatever ingredients they had in the fridge. Give baths, read stories, sing lullabies, and collapse into bed knowing he'd have to do it all again the next day. Weekends were for laundry, grocery shopping, playground visits, and trying to give Lily experiences that would fill the enormous mother-shaped hole in her life. Marcus had become an expert at braiding hair from YouTube tutorials, learned to paint fingernails without making too much of a mess, and could have conversations about Disney princesses that rivaled graduate-level literary analysis. The dreams Sarah had nurtured felt impossibly distant now. Opening his own shop required capital. He didn't have business knowledge he'd never developed, and energy reserves that had been depleted years ago. Most nights, Marcus fell asleep to the sound of his neighbor's television, bleeding through thin apartment walls, surrounded by bills he couldn't quite pay and dreams he couldn't quite reach. But he never complained, not once, because Lily was watching, learning how to handle disappointment and hardship from his example, and he'd be damned if he'd teach her that giving up was an option. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined as he drove away from Murphy's Corner Café that morning, was that the woman he'd just shown kindness to could have solved every financial problem he'd ever had with what she spent on lunch. Isabella Martinez's story was written in boardrooms and penthouse offices, in private jets, in five-star hotels, in languages of profit margins, in acquisition strategies that most people never learned to speak. But it began in the most ordinary of places, a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in East Los Angeles, where a brilliant little girl with enormous dreams learned that intelligence and determination could be weapons against poverty if you knew how to wield them properly. Isabella's parents, Miguel and Carmen Martinez, had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but hope and an unshakable belief that America would give their unborn children opportunities they'd never had. Miguel worked construction during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. Carmen took care of other people's children while raising her own, speaking Spanish at home and broken English everywhere else, determined that her daughter would grow up bilingual and bicultural in the best possible way. From the earliest age, Isabella had been different. While other kids played with toys, she organized them into complex systems. While others watched cartoons, she asked questions about how television worked, why some families had more money than others, and what she'd need to study to change the world. By age 8, she was reading her father's construction magazines, fascinated by the business of building things. By age 12, she'd started a small tutoring business, helping classmates with math homework for quarters and dollar bills that she saved in a shoebox under her bed. High school had been a launching pad rather than a holding pattern. Perfect grades, debate, team captain, student body, president, scholarship recipient. Isabella attacked every opportunity like her life depended on it, because in many ways it did. She understood that education was her ticket to a different kind of life, and she wasn't going to waste a single moment or chance. Stanford University had been her first taste of true privilege. Suddenly, she was surrounded by classmates who took wealth for granted, who'd never worried about electricity being shut off or whether there'd be enough money for groceries. But instead of being intimidated, Isabella was fascinated. She studied these people like an anthropologist, learning how money moved, how networks formed, how power was accumulated and wielded. Business school at Harvard had been where Isabella truly found her calling. Finance wasn't just numbers on spreadsheets, it was power pure and simple. The ability to fund dreams, create jobs, shape entire industries. While her classmates saw investment banking as a stepping stone to other careers, Isabella saw it as her true vocation. Her first job at Goldman Sachs had been brutal. 100-hour work weeks, impossible deadlines, colleagues who viewed her as both a curiosity and a threat. But Isabella thrived in high-pressure environments. Every deal she closed, every client she won, every $1 million she generated was proof that a girl from East LA could play in the biggest sandbox in the world and not just survive, but dominate. By age 25, Isabella had saved enough money to start her own investment firm. Martinez Capital Management began in a rented office with secondhand furniture and dreams bigger than the building could contain. But Isabella had learned something that most investors never figured out. The best opportunities weren't in obvious places. While everyone else chased tech startups and real estate bubbles, Isabella looked for undervalued companies with strong fundamentals, family businesses that needed capital to expand innovative technologies that were 5 years ahead of their time. Her first major success had been a small manufacturing company in Ohio that was on the verge of bankruptcy. While other investors saw only debt and declining sales, Isabella saw efficient processes, loyal employees, and a product line that just needed better marketing. She bought the company for a fraction of its value, invested in modernization and expansion, and sold it 3 years later for a 400% return. That success led to bigger opportunities, which led to bigger successes, which led to the kind of exponential growth that happens when intelligence meets preparation, meets opportunity. Within 10 years, Martinez Capital Management had grown from a one-woman operation to a multi-billion-dollar empire, with offices in New York, London, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo. Isabella's investment philosophy was simple but revolutionary. Find good people doing important work, give them the resources they need to succeed, and get out of their way. She funded renewable energy projects before they were fashionable, supported women and minority entrepreneurs when others wouldn't, and invested in education and healthcare technologies that prioritized social impact alongside financial returns. The financial press had given her nicknames that she privately despised but publicly embraced: the Oracle of Wall Street, the billionaire with a conscience, the woman who never sleeps. Magazine covers, conferences, keynotes, university commencements. Isabella's face and story had become synonymous with the American dream, realized through sheer force of will. But success at that level comes with risks that aren't immediately obvious. The higher Isabella climbed, the smaller her personal world became. Friendships became networking opportunities. Romantic relationships became potential conflicts of interest or security risks. Family dinners turned into strategy sessions about protecting wealth and managing public image. Every conversation was filtered through the lens of what someone might want from her. Every new person she met was automatically suspect until proven otherwise. The spontaneous, authentic connections that most people take for granted became impossible when you're worth billions of dollars and your every move is scrutinized by media competitors and fortune hunters. Isabella's penthouse apartment in Manhattan was a monument to her success and a prison of her own creation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of Central Park and the city skyline, but they also served as barriers between her and the normal world below. The space was filled with priceless art, first-edition books, and furniture that belonged in museums, but it felt less like a home and more like a very expensive hotel suite. Most nights, Isabella would stand at those massive windows, looking down at the lights of cars and apartments, wondering what it would feel like to be anonymous again. To walk into a coffee shop without being recognized, to have a conversation that wasn't about business, to meet someone who saw her as a person rather than an opportunity. The loneliness had been building for years, but Isabella had learned to ignore it the same way she ignored hunger during long negotiations or exhaustion during international travel. Emotions were inefficiencies that successful people learn to manage or eliminate, But some wounds don't heal just because you ignore them. Some needs don't disappear just because you stay busy enough to forget they exist. The night before her encounter with Marcus at Murphy's Corner Café, Isabella had attended the Metropolitan Museum of Art's annual gala, a $5,000 per plate charity event that served as both fundraiser and social theater for New York's elite. She'd worn a custom Valentino gown that cost more than most people's cars posed for photographers who knew her net worth better than her middle name, and made small talk with politicians, celebrities, and fellow billionaires who spoke in carefully constructed sentences designed to reveal nothing while gathering everything. The evening had been a masterclass in performative philanthropy. Write checks large enough to generate headlines, but small enough to not impact your quarterly returns. Smile for cameras while discussing tax-deductible giving strategies. Network with people who might be useful for future deals while pretending to care about whatever cause was being celebrated. Isabella had played her part perfectly, as she always did. She'd given the expected speech about the importance of arts education posed with the museum director and various board members, and written a check that would ensure her name appeared on a plaque somewhere in the building's marble halls. But as she'd sat in the back of her private car afterwards, still wearing the expensive gown and jewelry that felt more like armor than adornment, Isabella had felt the familiar emptiness settling in her chest like fog rolling over a harbor. Another evening surrounded by hundreds of people, and she'd felt completely alone. Her driver had asked where she wanted to go, and instead of giving her usual Manhattan address, Isabella had heard herself saying something that surprised them both. "Drive north, I need some air." They'd driven for over an hour in comfortable silence, past the lights of the city, past suburban developments and strip malls, until they had reached Cedar Valley, a small town that looked like something from a movie about simpler times. Isabella had checked into the Cedar Valley Inn, a bed and breakfast that probably hadn't been updated since the 1980s, but felt more like home than her penthouse ever had. She'd spent the night staring at floral wallpaper and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of small town quiet, wondering when her life had become so successful and so empty at the same time. Wondering if there was anyone left in the world who could see her as Isabella, rather than as a walking investment opportunity. That's how one of the most powerful women in America had ended up crying alone in a small-town cafe, wearing yesterday's expensive clothes, and feeling like she'd lost something essential that all her money couldn't buy back. What she couldn't have known was that a mechanic with grease under his fingernails and kindness in his heart was about to remind her what it felt like to be seen as a human being. The next morning, something pulled Marcus back to Murphy's Corner Cafe like a compass needle drawn to magnetic north. He told himself it was just routine, same as every other day: drop Lily at school, grab coffee, head to work. But if he was being completely honest, which Marcus tried to be about most things in life, part of him hoped he'd see her again. Not because he wanted anything from her. He'd learned long ago that expecting things from strangers was a sure path to disappointment. But something about that moment yesterday had stayed with him like a half-remembered melody playing quietly in the background of his thoughts as he changed oil and replaced brake pads and explained to Mrs. Henderson why her transmission was making that grinding noise. And there she was. Isabella sat at the same corner table wearing the same expensive coat, but looking somehow different. Less fragile, maybe. Less like she might shatter if someone spoke too loudly. When the cafe door chimed behind Marcus, she looked up and their eyes met across the crowded space. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, Isabella smiled. Not the polished professional smile that had graced 1,000 magazine covers, but something smaller, more genuine. Something that reached her eyes and made the corners crinkle just slightly. Marcus ordered his usual, black coffee with cream hot chocolate for Lily, but found himself glancing toward Isabella's table every few seconds. Should he say something, leave her alone? The social mathematics of the situation felt impossibly complex for someone who spent most of his time communicating with engines that either worked or didn't. But before he could overthink himself into paralysis, Isabella caught his eye and gestured gently toward the empty chair across from her. An invitation so subtle that anyone not paying attention would have missed it entirely. "If you have a minute," she said as he approached, her voice still carrying traces of yesterday's hoarseness, "I owe you more than a thank you." Marcus set his coffee down and slid into the wooden chair which creaked slightly under his weight. "You don't owe me anything." Still, She wrapped both hands around her mug like she was trying to absorb its warmth through osmosis. Thank you. I wasn't in the best place yesterday. No apology needed, Marcus replied. We all have days like that. Isabella nodded slowly, studying his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Isabella, she said finally, extending her hand across the scarred wooden table. Marcus Thompson, he replied, engulfing her smaller hand in his calloused grip. Her skin was soft in the way that spoke of expensive lotions and manicures, but her handshake was firm, confident. For a moment, the ambient noise of the cut seemed to fade into background static. They sat in that peculiar kind of silence that happens between strangers who recognize something familiar in each other. Not romantic attraction, exactly, but a deeper understanding. Two people carrying more history than they were ready to share, but somehow sensing they were safe in each other's presence. So, Isabella said, taking a careful sip of her coffee, are you from Cedar Valley originally? Born and raised, Marcus confirmed. Utewan. Just passing through, she said, which was technically true while being fundamentally misleading. It seems like a nice place. It has its charms, small enough that everyone knows everyone, which can be good or bad depending on what kind of week you're having. Isabella laughed, and Marcus realized it was the first genuine sound of joy he'd heard from her. It transformed her entire face, erasing years of carefully constructed professional composure and revealing someone younger, lighter, more alive. They talked for 47 minutes, though neither of them was watching the clock. The conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of old friends rather than strangers who'd met 24 hours earlier. Isabella asked about Cedar Valley's history, its people, its quirks and traditions. Marcus found himself describing the annual Founders Day parade with its 3 fire trucks and marching band that consisted mostly of middle schoolers playing instruments they'd been learning for 6 weeks. It sounds wonderfully normal, Isabella said with genuine longing in her voice. That's one way to put it, Marcus replied. What about you? What do you do when you're not passing through small towns? Isabella hesitated for just a fraction of a second, so briefly that someone less observant might have missed it entirely. I work in finance, investments mostly. It wasn't technically a lie, but it was the kind of radical understatement that billionaires use when they want to blend into normal conversations, like saying the sun is somewhat warm or the ocean is fairly wet. That must be interesting work, Marcus said politely. It can be. Though sometimes I think I'd rather work with my hands, fix things that are actually broken instead of just moving money around. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What kind of things would you want to fix? Isabella's smile was self-deprecating. I have absolutely no mechanical aptitude whatsoever. I once spent 2 hours trying to change a light bulb before realizing I was turning it the wrong direction. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, Marcus said automatically. Though to be fair, some European fixtures are reversed, so you might not have been completely wrong. You're very kind to give me the benefit of the doubt. What struck Marcus most was what Isabella didn't ask. She didn't inquire about his job title, his income, his 5-year plan, or any of the questions that people usually led with when making new acquaintances. She seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts about books, movies, the best hiking trails in the area, whether he preferred coffee or tea, and why Cedar Valley had never bothered to fix the pothole on Main Street that had been growing larger every winter for the past 5 years. For Isabella, the conversation was equally revelatory. When was the last time someone had asked about her favorite childhood memory instead of her investment strategy? When had anyone cared more about her opinion on local politics than her thoughts on Federal Reserve policy? Marcus listened to her answers with the kind of focused attention that had nothing to do with networking and everything to do with genuine curiosity about her as a person. You ever think about doing your own thing? Isabella asked, eventually, the question emerging so naturally that it didn't feel calculated or loaded with hidden meaning. Marcus paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. What kind of thing? Your own shop. Instead of working for someone else, building something that's yours. Marcus set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, which protested with another small creak. Sure, I've thought about it. The same way people think about winning the lottery or traveling to Mars. Nice idea, but not exactly realistic for someone in my situation. What would it look like, though, if money wasn't an issue? Marcus found himself describing a vision he had buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. A garage that prioritized honesty over profit margins, Fair prices, quality work, and enough space to train young people who couldn't afford trade school but had the aptitude and desire to learn. A place where single mothers wouldn't feel like they were being taken advantage of when their cars needed repair. Where families could bring their vehicles without worrying about being sold services they didn't need. There's a shop like that in the next town over, Marcus said, or there was anyway. The owner retired last year and couldn't find anyone to take over who shared his values. Most buyers just wanted the customer list and the location. Isabella listened with the kind of intense focus that made Marcus feel like his words actually mattered. She asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she was truly hearing him, not just waiting for her turn to speak. "It sounds like more than a business," she said finally. "It sounds like a community service." "I guess that's one way to look at it," my wife used to say. Marcus stopped abruptly, surprised by how easily Sarah had entered the conversation. He rarely mentioned her to strangers. "She used to say what?" Isabella prompted gently. "She used to say that honest work done with integrity was its own form of ministry. That treating people fairly, especially when they're vulnerable, was a way of making the world a little bit better." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of that philosophy. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Marcus said simply. "Still is in the ways that matter." Without thinking about it, Isabella reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a business card. Not one of her official Martinez Capital Management cards with the embossed logo and Manhattan address. This was something simpler, cream-colored cardstock with just her name and a phone number written in elegant script. She slid it across the table toward Marcus. "I know this might sound strange, but if you ever want to talk more about that garage idea, call me. Sometimes dreams are more realistic than they appear." Marcus picked up the card, examining it with the careful attention he usually reserved for engine diagnostics. "Isabella Martinez," he read aloud. "Just Isabella is fine." He looked up at her, something unspoken passing between them. The card felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibility and the kind of potential that made his chest tight with hope and fear in equal measure. "I'm not asking for anything," Isabella said quickly, "and I'm not making promises I can't keep. But sometimes it helps to have someone to bounce ideas off, someone who understands that good work matters." Marcus nodded and slipped the card into his wallet, right behind the photo of Lily that he carried everywhere. "Thank you for listening, I mean. It's been a while since I talked about that stuff with anyone." Isabella gathered her coat and scarf, preparing to leave. "Thank you for the coffee, and for reminding me that kindness still exists in the world." As she stood to go, Marcus felt compelled to say something else. "Isabella, whatever brought you to Cedar Valley, I hope it works out okay." She paused, looking down at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "It already has," she said softly. Marcus watched her walk away, noting the confident way she carried herself despite yesterday's obvious emotional distress. Something about her felt familiar and foreign at the same time, like a song you'd heard before but couldn't quite place. He sat in the cafe for another 10 minutes, turning her business card over in his hands and trying to understand why their conversation had felt so significant. It wasn't romantic attraction exactly, though Isabella was undeniably beautiful. It was something deeper, the recognition that comes when you meet someone who sees the world through a similar lens, even if you're looking at it from completely different vantage points. By the time Marcus finally left Murphy's Corner Cafe, he had no idea that the simple business card in his wallet belonged to one of the most powerful people in the country. He didn't know that Isabella Martinez could fund his garage dreams with what she spent on a weekend trip to Paris. He certainly didn't know that their chance encounter was about to set in motion a series of events that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. All he knew was that he'd met someone who'd listened to his dreams without judgment and treated them like they mattered. In a world that often felt indifferent to individual aspirations, that was no small gift. And for Isabella, walking back to her hotel through the quiet streets of Cedar Valley, the morning had been equally transformative. For 47 minutes, she'd been just Isabella. Not the billionaire investor, not the woman whose decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars, just a person having coffee with another person who saw her as human rather than as an opportunity. The business card she'd given Marcus represented more than just contact information. It was a bridge between two worlds, an invitation to possibility, and a small act of faith that sometimes the most important connections happen in the most unexpected places. Neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. 3 days passed before Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts and Isabella's business card. Work had been typically chaotic. A transmission rebuild that fought him every step of the way, 2 brake jobs, and a diagnostic puzzle involving Mrs. Peterson's Ford that made grinding noises only on Tuesdays. Lily had been fighting a minor cold that required extra attention, bedtime stories, and more patience than usual as she struggled to fall asleep with a stuffy nose. But now, finally, on a quiet Thursday evening and after Lily had drifted off, surrounded by tissues and her collection of stuffed animals, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a cup of reheated coffee and the mysterious business card that had been burning a hole in his wallet for 72 hours. Isabella Martinez. The name felt elegant on his tongue, sophisticated in a way that seemed to belong to someone from a different world entirely. The phone number was local, though, which struck him as odd for someone who worked in finance and was just passing through Cedar Valley. Marcus had learned not to Google every person he met. It felt like an invasion of privacy, and besides, he preferred learning about people through conversation rather than search results. But something about Isabella's careful word choices, her expensive clothes, and the way she talked about dreams being more realistic than they appear, had planted seeds of curiosity that were growing stronger each day. Finally succumbing to impulses he didn't fully understand, Marcus opened his laptop and typed Isabella Martinez Finance into the search bar. The results that populated his screen made him question whether he was losing his mind. Isabella Martinez wasn't just someone who worked in finance. She was Isabella Martinez, founder and CEO of Martinez Capital Management, one of the most successful investment firms in the country. The woman who'd sat across from him in Murphy's Corner Café, asking about hiking trails and laughing at his stories about small-town politics, was worth an estimated $2.7 billion. Marcus scrolled through article after article, his coffee growing cold, as he absorbed the magnitude of his misunderstanding. Forbes had named her one of the most powerful women in America. Time magazine had featured her on their cover with the headline, "The Conscience of Capitalism." The Wall Street Journal had written a 3-part series about her investment philosophy and its impact on sustainable business practices. There were photos of Isabella at White House state dinners, speaking at economic summits, accepting awards from universities and humanitarian organizations. In every image, she looked polished, confident, untouchable. Nothing like the vulnerable woman who'd been crying alone in a small-town cafe. But the more Marcus read, the more complex the picture became. Article after article mentioned Isabella's reputation for privacy, her reluctance to give personal interviews, her tendency to let her work speak for itself. Several pieces speculated about her personal life, but the speculation was based on absence rather than presence. No public relationships, no social media presence, no leaked photos from vacation spots or charity galas. One particularly insightful profile in Fortune magazine suggested that Isabella's success had come at the cost of personal connections. She has created an empire that spans continents, the article noted, but those closest to her describe a woman who struggles with the isolation that often accompanies extreme wealth and power. Marcus closed the laptop and sat in his quiet kitchen, trying to reconcile the woman he'd met with the figure described in these articles. The Isabella who'd asked about his dreams and listened with genuine interest was the same person who controlled billions of dollars and could influence global markets with her investment decisions. The business cards suddenly felt radioactive in his hands. What did someone like Isabella Martinez want with a small-town mechanic? Was this some kind of philanthropic project? A tax write-off disguised as kindness? The cynical part of his brain developed through years of financial struggle and disappointment, began constructing elaborate theories about ulterior motives and hidden agendas. But then he remembered the tears, the genuine laughter, the way she talked about wanting to work with her hands instead of just moving money around. Those moments had felt real in a way that was difficult to fake even for someone with Isabella's resources and sophistication. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He called the number on the card. Isabella answered on the second ring as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Hello, Marcus." Her voice was warm, familiar, nothing like the formal tone he'd expected from someone who probably fielded calls from heads of state and Fortune 500 CEOs. "Isabella Guillermo," he said, then immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all. I was actually hoping you'd call. Marcus took a deep breath. I looked you up. There was a pause that seemed to stretch across continents. When Isabella spoke again, her voice was smaller, more careful. And and I'm wondering why someone who could buy and sell my entire town decided to spend her morning talking to me about hiking trails. Isabella's laugh was rueful. That's a fair question. Can I ask you something first? Sure. How do you feel about me now? Now that you know, Marcus considered the question seriously. Confused mostly, maybe a little intimidated, but not different if that makes sense. You're still the person who was kind to someone having a bad day. It makes perfect sense, Isabella said softly, and that's exactly why I didn't tell you. I don't understand. Marcus, when you walked over to my table that first morning, what did you see? He thought back to that moment, trying to remember his first impression before all the subsequent information had complicated things. Someone who looked sad, someone who seemed alone. Exactly. Not my net worth, not my company, not what I could do for you or what you could get from me. Just another human being who might need a small kindness. Marcus felt something shift in his understanding. How often does that happen for you? Almost never, Isabella admitted. Do you know what it's like to walk into a room and watch people's faces change the moment they recognize you, to have every conversation filtered through calculations about what they can gain from knowing you? I can't imagine. That morning in the cafe was the first time in years that someone saw me as just Isabella. Not Isabella Martinez, billionaire investor, but Isabella who was having a terrible day and needed someone to care enough to notice. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. So when you asked about the garage, I was genuinely curious about your dreams, about what you'd build if you had the chance. And yes, she paused. I have the resources to make those dreams possible. But that's not why I asked. Then why? Because I've spent the last 15 years funding projects that look good on paper but don't necessarily make the world better. I've written checks for companies that prioritize profits over people investments, that generate returns without creating value. And I'm tired of it. Isabella's voice grew stronger, more passionate. You talked about a garage that would serve its community with honesty and integrity, about training young people who can't afford traditional education, about treating customers fairly, especially when they're vulnerable. That's not just a business plan, Marcus. That's a mission. But you barely know me. I know enough. I know you bought coffee for a stranger without expecting anything in return. I know you spoke about your late wife with love instead of bitterness. I know you're raising a daughter as a single father while maintaining your integrity in a job that probably doesn't pay you what you're worth. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Isabella, I'm not offering charity, she continued. I'm offering partnership. You bring the vision, the expertise, the commitment to doing things right. I bring the capital. We build something together that matters. Why me, though? You could fund anyone. Because most people who have the resources to build something significant have already been corrupted by those resources. They've learned to cut corners, to prioritize profits over principles, to see customers as numbers rather than neighbors. Isabella paused, then spoke more quietly. You still believe that honest work done with integrity is its own form of ministry. That's becoming a rare thing in this world, Marcus, and I want to help preserve it. Marcus sat in his kitchen, holding a phone that connected him to possibilities he'd never dared imagine. The logical part of his brain was screaming warnings about deals that seemed too good to be true. But his heart was remembering Sarah's voice, her absolute conviction that he was capable of more than he believed. What would this partnership look like? He asked finally. Whatever you want it to look like. You design the garage, hire the staff, set the policies. I provide the funding and stay out of your way unless you ask for help. And in return, I get to watch someone build something beautiful. Someone who'll treat this opportunity with the respect it deserves. Marcus stood up from his kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the small town that had been his entire world for 36 years. Cedar Valley was a good place filled with good people who deserved the kind of honest service he wanted to provide. I need to think about this, he said. Of course. Take all the time you need. Isabella. Yes. Thank you. for seeing something in me that I'm not sure I see in myself. Marcus, yeah, that's exactly why you're the right person for this. After they hung up, Marcus sat in his quiet kitchen until nearly midnight, turning Isabella's offer over in his mind like a mechanic examining a complex engine problem. Every logical analysis suggested this was too good to be true, too big, too risky. But beneath the fear and self-doubt, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Real tangible hope that maybe, just maybe, Sarah's dreams weren't as impossible as he'd convinced himself they were. The next morning brought new complications and deeper revelations about the woman who'd entered his life like a force of nature disguised as a chance encounter. Marcus spent the next week in a state of constant internal debate that affected everything from his appetite to his ability to concentrate on routine repairs. The conversation with Isabella played on repeat in his mind while he changed oil, replaced brake pads, and explained to customers why their cars were making concerning noises. Lily noticed his distraction during their evening routines. "Daddy, you seem far away," she said one night as he mechanically braided her hair before bed. "Are you thinking about Mommy?" "Kind of, sweetheart," Marcus replied, which was true in a sideways fashion. Every major decision since Sarah's death had been filtered through imagined conversations with her mental consultations with the woman who'd believed in his potential more than he'd ever believed in himself. "What would Mommy say about the garage lady?" Lily asked with the unsettling perceptiveness that children sometimes display. Marcus paused mid-braid. He'd mentioned Isabella only in passing, describing her as someone he'd met at the cafe who was interested in his work. But Lily had an uncanny ability to sense when adults were carrying weightier concerns than they acknowledged. "I think Mommy would want me to be careful," Marcus said slowly, "but she'd also want me to be brave." "Are you scared of the garage lady?" "Not scared of her exactly, more scared of the idea that maybe I'm not ready for something this big." Lily turned to face him, her 7-year-old eyes serious and thoughtful. "But what if you are ready and you just don't know it yet?" The simplicity of her logic was both comforting and terrifying. Children hadn't yet learned that dreams were supposed to be impossible, that extraordinary opportunities were probably traps, that people like Isabella Martinez didn't offer genuine partnerships to people like Marcus Thompson without hidden motives. That night, after Lily was asleep, Marcus pulled out the folder of documents Isabella had promised to send. It had arrived by courier that afternoon. Not regular mail, but hand-delivered by a professional service that probably cost more than Marcus spent on groceries in a month. Inside were architectural plans for a garage facility unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. Not just service bays and an office, but a complete automotive education center, with classroom space, modern equipment, and even a small area designed for customers to wait comfortably while their cars were serviced. The financial projections were equally impressive and intimidating. Isabella was proposing an initial investment of $1.2 million to purchase land, construct the facility, and provide operating capital for the first year. The paperwork outlined partnership terms that seemed almost comically favorable to Marcus. He would own 60% of the business with complete operational control, while Isabella would be a silent partner whose only involvement would be providing capital and occasional strategic advice when requested. There were no hidden clauses, no aggressive timelines, no performance requirements that seemed designed to trip him up. The legal language was straightforward enough that Marcus could understand it without hiring an attorney, though Isabella had included a note encouraging him to have everything reviewed by independent legal counsel before making any decisions. The more Marcus studied the documents, the more surreal the entire situation became. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was a complete transformation of his life's trajectory handed to him by someone he'd known for less than 2 weeks. And that's exactly what terrified him. Marcus had learned through painful experience that anything that seemed too good to be true usually was. The universe didn't hand out million-dollar opportunities to single fathers who barely kept their own cars running. Billionaires didn't offer genuine partnerships to small-town mechanics they'd met in cafes. There had to be an angle, a catch, some element of the arrangement that would eventually reveal itself and destroy everything he'd worked to build. More troubling was the question of what accepting Isabella's offer would mean for his identity and his daughter's understanding of how the world worked. Marcus had spent years teaching Lily that success came through hard work, integrity, and patience, that you earned what you received through dedication and sacrifice. What lesson would it send if he suddenly accepted a windfall that he hadn't earned through traditional means? The practical benefits were undeniable. The garage would provide financial security for Lily's future opportunities to serve his community in meaningful ways, and the chance to build something lasting that honored Sarah's belief in his potential. But the emotional cost felt potentially devastating. How could he look at himself in the mirror, knowing that his success had been purchased rather than earned? These concerns crystallized during a conversation with his brother Danny, who drove down from the state capitol that weekend to visit. Danny was 3 years older than Marcus and had always been the more cautious sibling, the one who read fine print and questioned windfall opportunities. "This sounds incredible," Danny said after Marcus had outlined Isabella's proposal. "Almost too incredible." "That's what worries me," Marcus admitted. "Have you Googled this woman, actually looked into her background and reputation?" "Extensively. She's legitimate, successful, and by all accounts ethical in her business dealings. But but I keep wondering why me? Out of all the mechanics in the country, all the small business owners who'd kill for this opportunity, why choose someone she met by accident in a coffee shop?" Danny was quiet for a moment, sipping the beer Marcus had offered him, while Lily played in the backyard, visible through the kitchen window. "Maybe that's exactly why," he said finally. "What do you mean? Think about it from her perspective. She's probably approached by people asking for money every single day. Business proposals, investment opportunities, charitable requests. Everyone who talks to her wants something. And oh man, and then she meets you. You buy her coffee because she looks sad, not because you know who she is. You talk to her about your dreams without asking for funding. You treat her like a regular person instead of a walking bank account." Marcus considered this perspective. "So you think her offer is genuine?" "I think her offer is genuine, but that doesn't mean you should accept it." "Why not?" Danny set down his beer and looked directly at his brother. "Because you've spent the last 4 years building a life based on self-reliance and independence. You've shown Lily that success comes through hard work and determination. Accepting a handout, even from someone with good intentions, might undermine everything you've tried to teach her. But what if it's not a handout? What if it's a legitimate business partnership? Then you need to ask yourself whether you're ready for that level of responsibility and visibility. This woman is apparently famous, wealthy, connected to powerful people. Are you prepared for your quiet life to become complicated?" That question haunted Marcus for the next several days. Cedar Valley was a place where privacy was respected and normalcy was valued. What would happen to that peaceful existence if he became business partners with a billionaire? Would reporters start calling? Would competitors try to undermine his success by claiming it wasn't earned? Would Lily's childhood be affected by attention and scrutiny she'd never asked for? The more Marcus thought about these potential complications, the more anxious he became. Sarah had always been the dreamer in their relationship, but she'd also been fiercely protective of their family's privacy and independence. What would she really think about accepting Isabella's offer? Finally, after a week of sleepless nights and distracted days, Marcus made his decision. He called Isabella and asked to meet her at Murphy's Corner Café. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at their usual table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. She looked up as he approached, and Marcus could see hope mixed with apprehension in her expression. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said as he sat down across from her. "Of course. Have you had time to review everything?" Marcus nodded, pulling the folder of documents from his jacket. "I have, and I've thought about it carefully." Isabella's hands tightened slightly around her coffee cup. "And Puaitan, I can't accept your offer." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Isabella's face didn't change dramatically, but Marcus saw something flicker in her eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or hurt. "May I ask why?" she said quietly. Marcus had rehearsed this conversation, but sitting across from Isabella, seeing the genuine care in her expression made the words more difficult than he'd anticipated. "Because it feels too much like charity," he said finally. "And because I'm not sure I'm ready for the kind of partnership you're offering." "It's not charity, Marcus. I thought I'd made that clear. I know you believe that. But from my perspective, accepting $1 million investment from someone I've known for 2 weeks feels like accepting something I haven't earned." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "What would make it feel earned?" "Time, maybe. A track record of success in smaller ventures. Proof that I can build something significant without help." And how long would that take? Marcus shrugged. 5 years, 10. Maybe never. Maybe I'm not cut out for this kind of success. Or maybe you're exactly cut out for it, but you've been conditioned to believe that good things don't happen to good people without a catch. Her words hit closer to home than Marcus wanted to admit. Maybe, but I'd rather fail on my own terms than succeed on someone else's. Isabella nodded slowly, and Marcus was struck by how gracefully she was handling his rejection. I understand. I don't agree, but I understand. You're not angry. Disappointed, yes. Angry, no. She paused. Can I tell you something? Of course. I've made dozens of investment offers over the years. Some have been accepted enthusiastically. Some have been negotiated extensively. Some have been rejected for various reasons. But this is the first time someone has turned me down because they felt they hadn't earned the opportunity. Is that good or bad? It's exactly why I wanted to partner with you in the first place. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them processing the weight of the decision and its implications. Finally, Isabella gathered her purse and coat. Marcus? Yes. If you change your mind tomorrow, next month, next year, the offer stands. I'd rather wait for the right partner than settle for someone who doesn't share my values. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for being exactly who I thought you were. As Isabella walked away from Murphy's Corner Cafe for what Marcus assumed would be the last time he felt a complex mixture of relief and regret that would stay with him for weeks afterward. He'd protected his independence and maintained his principles, but he'd also closed the door on possibilities that might never come again. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she asked him about the garage lady one more time. Did you tell her no, Daddy? Yes, sweetheart, I did. Are you sad about it? Marcus considered the question carefully. A little, but sometimes making the right decision and making the easy decision are two different things. Do you think Mommy would be proud of you? I hope so, Lily. I really hope so. But as Marcus lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of his small apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. 5 days passed without any contact from Isabella, and Marcus began to convince himself that their story was over. She would return to her world of billion-dollar investments in global influence, while he would continue his routine of oil changes and brake repairs in Cedar Valley. It was probably for the best, he told himself. Clean breaks were usually easier than prolonged complications. But on a Thursday morning that started like any other, Marcus walked into Murphy's Corner Café to find Isabella sitting at their usual table. Not reading, not working on a laptop, not making phone calls. Just sitting quietly with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, staring out the window at the early morning light filtering through the old oak trees that lined Main Street. She looked different somehow, less polished, more vulnerable. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the sophisticated styles she'd worn during their previous meetings. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater that looked like something a normal person might own, rather than the expensive coats and tailored clothing that had marked her as someone from a different economic universe. When she saw Marcus enter, she didn't smile or wave or give any indication that she expected him to join her. She simply watched him with an expression that seemed to say, I'm here if you want to talk, but I won't pressure you if you don't. Marcus ordered his usual coffee and stood at the counter for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted to take his drink and leave to maintain the clean separation he'd established 5 days earlier. But a larger part was curious about why Isabella had returned to Cedar Valley and what had brought that particular expression to her face. Finally, he walked over to her table and sat down without asking permission. Good morning, he said simply. Good morning, she replied. They sat in silence for several minutes, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with things unsaid. Marcus studied Isabella's face, noting the shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well, the absence of makeup that revealed a sprinkling of freckles across her nose, the way her shoulders seemed to carry less tension than during their previous encounters. I didn't expect to see you again, Marcus said finally. I didn't expect to come back, Isabella admitted, but I couldn't stop thinking about our last conversation, about my rejection of your offer, about what you said about earning opportunities versus accepting them. Marcus waited for her to continue. I've been thinking about that concept a lot over the past few days, about what it means to earn something, about whether success has to come through struggle to be legitimate. And what have you concluded? Isabella was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I think I've been confusing earning with suffering, as if the only way to deserve good things is to endure hardship first. I'm not sure I understand. Marcus, you've been earning the right to own your own garage for years. Every honest repair you've made, every customer you've treated fairly, every time you've chosen integrity over profit, that's been building your qualifications. The fact that you don't have the capital to fund your dreams doesn't mean you haven't earned the right to pursue them. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. But accepting investment from someone I barely know. Let me tell you something about my world, Isabella interrupted gently. I spend most of my time around people who inherited their wealth, married into it, or acquired it through methods that prioritize profit over people. Do you know how rare it is to meet someone who's built their reputation through consistent ethical behavior? I'm sure there are others. Fewer than you might think, and almost none who would turn down a life-changing opportunity because they were worried about earning it. Isabella leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. You want to know why I really offered to partner with you? It wasn't charity, and it wasn't a whim. It was selfishness. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Selfishness. I've spent 15 years building a fortune that I don't know how to spend in ways that actually matter. I've funded companies that make products people don't need, invested in technologies that eliminate jobs without creating new ones, written checks for charitable causes that make me feel better without addressing root problems. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. But that morning when you bought me coffee, when you saw someone who needed kindness and provided it without calculating the cost or benefit, I remembered what it felt like to witness genuine goodness. And I realized that I wanted to be part of something good for once. Marcus was quiet, processing the weight of her confession. I need this partnership more than you do, Isabella continued. You could probably figure out a way to open your garage eventually with or without my help. But I might never again find someone who approaches business with the integrity you've demonstrated. Someone who would turn down easy money because they want to earn their success honestly. I never thought of it that way. Because you're not selfish enough, Isabella said with a small smile, which is exactly what makes you the right partner for what I'm trying to build. What are you trying to build? Isabella looked out the window again, watching early commuters walking past on the sidewalk outside. A legacy that isn't just about accumulating wealth, a portfolio of investments that actually improve people's lives, a business empire that proves you can be profitable without being predatory. She turned back to Marcus. Your garage would be the first piece of that vision, a demonstration that honest business practices can compete with corporate chains, a training ground for young people who need skills and opportunities, a community resource that treats customers like neighbors rather than profit centers. Marcus felt the familiar stirring of possibility, the same sensation he'd experienced when Sarah used to describe her dreams for their future. But now it was complicated by his growing understanding of Isabella's own needs and motivations. What would you get out of it? He asked. Really, the satisfaction of knowing that my money was being used to build something meaningful. The opportunity to learn from someone who still believes that work can be a form of service. And maybe if I'm lucky, the chance to remember what it feels like to be part of something that matters. Isabella's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I've been incredibly lonely, Marcus. Success at my level requires sacrificing most human connections. Everyone who approaches me wants something, needs something, or is trying to sell something. You're the first person in years who's treated me like a regular human being. That's because you are a regular human being. You just happen to have more money than most. Do you know how revolutionary that perspective is in my world? Marcus was beginning to understand that his rejection of Isabella's offer hadn't been the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a deeper conversation about what both of them needed and what they might be able to build together. If I were to reconsider your offer, he said slowly, what would need to change? Nothing about the business terms, but maybe everything about how we approach the partnership. What do you mean? I mean that instead of me investing in your garage, maybe we could build something together. You bring the operational expertise and community connections. I bring the capital and business development experience. We both contribute our strengths and learn from each other's perspectives. Marcus felt the last of his resistance crumbling. And what would that look like day to day, however we want it to look? Maybe I spend a few days a month in Cedar Valley learning about automotive repair and small town business dynamics. Maybe you occasionally visit New York and see how investment decisions get made at the corporate level. Maybe we create a model for ethical business practices that other people can replicate. You'd really want to spend time in Cedar Valley. Isabella's smile was genuine and unguarded. Marcus, the three conversations we've had in this cafe have been more meaningful to me than most of the interactions I've had in the past 3 years. Why wouldn't I want to spend more time in a place where people treat each other with basic human decency? They talked for another hour working through details and possibilities that neither had considered during their earlier conversations. By the time they finally left Murphy's Corner Café, they'd laid the foundation for a partnership that was about much more than building a garage. They were building a bridge between two worlds, a model for how business could serve community needs, and possibly, though neither would admit it yet, the beginning of a friendship that would transform both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As they walked toward their respective cars, Isabella turned to Marcus with a question that surprised them both. Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not to talk about that business, just to continue our conversation about books and hiking trails and why Cedar Valley has never fixed that pothole on Main Street. Marcus smiled. I'd like that, but I should probably mention that dinner with me usually involves a 7-year-old who asks a lot of questions and has strong opinions about whether vegetables belong on pizza. I like people with strong opinions about pizza, Isabella replied. And I've never had dinner with a 7-year-old who wasn't related to me. It sounds like an adventure. Oh, fair warning, Lily has been known to ask personal questions that would make investigative journalists uncomfortable. Good, I could use some practice with honest questions. And just like that, the walls that both Marcus and Isabella had built around their hearts began to develop small, hopeful cracks that would eventually let light in. Dinner at Marcus's apartment was scheduled for Saturday evening, giving both of them several days to contemplate the strangeness of their evolving relationship. For Marcus, the anticipation mixed nervousness with excitement. He hadn't entertained anyone for dinner since Sarah's death, and certainly never someone whose net worth could probably purchase his entire neighborhood. For Isabella, the prospect was equally daunting, but for different reasons. When was the last time she'd sat at someone's kitchen table for a home-cooked meal? Most of her dining experiences took place in restaurants where the servers knew her preferences and the wine list started at prices that could feed a family for a week. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of late autumn weather that made indoor spaces feel especially cozy. Marcus spent the morning cleaning his small apartment with an attention to detail that amused even him. Lily helped by organizing her toys into neat piles and arguing about whether they should use the fancy paper towels Isabella was visiting. She's not the Queen of England, Lily, Marcus said, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. But she's important, right? You said she was important. She's successful. That's different from important. Lily considered this distinction with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to philosophical questions. What makes someone important? Marcus paused in his cleaning, realizing he'd stumbled into exactly the kind of conversation that Sarah would have handled with grace and wisdom. I think important people are the ones who make other people's lives better, who help instead of hurt, who treat everyone with kindness. Like when you bought the sad lady coffee. Yeah, like that. So maybe she thinks you're important too. Out of the mouths of babes, Isabella arrived at exactly 6 o'clock carrying a bottle of wine and a small wrapped present that immediately captured Lily's attention. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look approachable and normal, though Marcus noticed she'd traded her expensive handbag for something more modest. I hope you don't mind, Isabella said, handing Marcus the wine. I brought something for Lily too, if that's okay. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. Lily approached with the cautious curiosity that children display around new adults. Are you the garage lady? I suppose I am, Isabella replied, kneeling to Lily's eye level. You must be Lily. Your dad has told me a lot about you. He told me about you too. He said you cry sometimes, but that's okay, because everyone cries. Isabella glanced at Marcus with raised eyebrows. Your dad is very wise. Can I open my present now? The gift was a children's book about a girl who wanted to be a mechanic, beautifully illustrated and clearly chosen with care, rather than grabbed randomly from a bookstore display. Lily examined each page with the intensity of an art critic, asking questions about the story and demanding that Isabella read it aloud immediately. Dinner was spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, and a salad that Lily picked at reluctantly. Nothing fancy, but everything prepared with muffin and served with the kind of warm hospitality that made expensive restaurants feel cold by comparison. "This is delicious," Isabella said, and Marcus could tell she meant it. "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal." "You don't cook." "I have a kitchen that looks like it belongs in a magazine and gets used primarily for reheating takeout." Lily found this fascinating. "What do you eat for breakfast?" "Usually coffee and whatever's in the office cafeteria." "That's not breakfast," Lily declared with 7-year-old authority. "Breakfast is eggs and toast and orange juice and sometimes pancakes if Daddy's not in a hurry." "You're absolutely right," Isabella agreed solemnly. "I've been doing breakfast wrong." The conversation flowed with surprising ease. Isabella asked Lily about school, her friends, her favorite subjects, and what she wanted to be when she grew up. Lily in turn grilled Isabella about living in New York, whether she'd ever met any movie stars, and why adults drank coffee when chocolate milk tasted better. "Do you have kids?" Lily asked during dessert, which was ice cream with chocolate sauce that Marcus had let her apply herself. "No, I don't," Isabella replied. "Why not?" Marcus intervened quickly. "Lily, that's a personal question." "It's okay," Isabella said. "It's a fair question." She looked at Lily thoughtfully. "I've been so busy with work that I haven't had time to think about having a family." "That's sad," Lily said with characteristic directness. "Families are the best part." "You're right," Isabella agreed. "They are." After dinner, while Lily played with toys in the living room, Marcus and Isabella cleaned dishes together in the small kitchen. The domestic routine felt surprisingly natural, like they'd done this countless times before. "Thank you for this," Isabella said, drying a plate with a dish towel that had seen better days. "I needed to remember what normal feels like." "This is pretty normal for us. Maybe even a little fancy since we used actual napkins instead of paper towels." "I noticed that. Very classy." They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Isabella spoke again. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you ready to move forward with the garage project?" Marcus set down the pot he'd been scrubbing and looked at her directly. "Yes, but I want to make sure we're building something that honors both our values." "What would that look like?" "Transparent business practices, fair wages for employees, services priced to be accessible to working families, training programs for young people who need opportunities, and a commitment to serving the community rather than just extracting profit from it." Isabella smiled. "Those are exactly my values too. And even if it means lower profits than we could get by cutting corners, especially then, sustainable success is better than quick profits." They shook hands over the sink, sealing a partnership that was about much more than business. It was about proving that ethical practices could compete in an often unethical marketplace, about creating opportunities for people who needed them most, and about building something that would make their community stronger. "So what happens next?" Marcus asked. "Next, we start planning. Land acquisition, architectural designs, equipment purchases, staffing strategies. I can handle the financial and legal aspects if you focus on the operational elements. How long do you think it will take? If we push hard, we could break ground in the spring and open by fall." Marcus felt excitement building in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced when Sarah first started talking about their shared dreams. But this time it was tempered with the wisdom that comes from loss and the maturity that comes from raising a child alone. "Isabella, yes. Thank you, not just for the opportunity, but for seeing something in me that I wasn't sure was there. Thank you for reminding me that success means more than just accumulating wealth." From the living room came Lily's voice calling for Isabella to come see the tower she'd built with her blocks. Isabella excused herself, leaving Marcus alone in the kitchen with a feeling of profound gratitude and possibility. As he listened to Isabella's genuine laughter, mixing with his daughter's delighted giggles, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what success could look like. It wasn't just about achieving financial stability or professional recognition. It was about building connections, creating value for others, and finding ways to make the world a little bit better through honest work and authentic relationships. The garage project officially began the following Monday, with a phone call that changed the trajectory of both their lives permanently. Marcus, Isabella's voice carried an excitement he'd never heard before. I found the perfect location. Where? Do you know the old Peterson's hardware building on the corner of Main and Oak? Marcus knew it well. The building had been empty for 3 years since old Pete Peterson had retired and couldn't find a buyer who shared his commitment to serving the community rather than maximizing profits. It was a substantial structure with good bones, plenty of space, and a location that would be convenient for most of Cedar Valley's residents. Pete's been looking for the right buyer, Marcus said, someone who would honor the building's history and serve the neighborhood. I spoke with him this morning. He wants to meet with both of us this afternoon. The meeting with Pete Peterson was both business negotiation and community vetting process rolled into one. Pete, now in his mid-70s, had operated Peterson's Hardware for 43 years, becoming something of an institution in Cedar Valley. He knew every family in town, had extended credit during tough times, and had trained dozens of young people in customer service and work ethic. I'm not just selling a building, Pete explained as he showed them through the space. I'm passing on a responsibility. This corner has been serving the community since 1952. Whoever takes it over needs to understand that they're becoming part of something bigger than just a business. Marcus walked through the space with a growing sense of excitement and possibility. The main floor was spacious enough for multiple service bays with high ceilings that could accommodate lifts and large vehicles. The basement offered perfect storage space for parts and equipment. A second floor, currently used for storage, could be converted into classroom space for the training programs he'd envisioned. What are your intentions for the property? Pete asked Isabella directly. To support Marcus in building an automotive service center that prioritizes honesty, fair pricing, and community service. We also want to establish training programs for young people who might not otherwise have access to technical education. Pete studied Isabella carefully. He'd lived in Cedar Valley long enough to recognize when outsiders were speaking genuine intentions versus polished marketing language. And what's your role in all this? He asked. I'm providing the capital investment. Marcus will own and operate the business according to his values and vision. Why? Because I believe that businesses should serve their communities, not exploit them. Marcus has demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity, and commitment that this community deserves. Pete nodded slowly, then turned to Marcus. Your wife used to shop here regular. Sarah Thompson was good people. Yes, sir, she was. She used to talk about your dreams of having your own place. Said you were the most honest mechanic she'd ever known, and that was saying something since her daddy was a mechanic too. Marcus felt his throat tighten. I didn't know she talked about that. Sarah believed in you something fierce, said you just needed the right opportunity to show what you could build. Pete walked to the large front windows, looking out at the quiet intersection that had been his view for more than 4 decades. I've had 17 offers on this building in the past 3 years. Every one of them wanted to change its character, turn it into something that would serve their needs rather than the community's needs. He turned back to Marcus and Isabella. But Sarah was right about you, son, and if this lady's willing to invest in your vision without trying to control it, then maybe it's time for this old building to serve a new purpose. The handshake that sealed the deal felt like more than a business transaction. It was a passing of tradition, a commitment to community values, and the beginning of something that would honor the past while building toward a better future. Over the next 6 weeks, the old Peterson's Hardware building transformed into something that exceeded even Marcus's most optimistic dreams. Isabella brought in architects who listened carefully to Marcus's operational requirements and designed space that maximized both efficiency and customer comfort. Contractors who normally worked on million-dollar Manhattan penthouses found themselves renovating a small-town garage with the same attention to detail they brought to luxury projects. The transformation was remarkable. The main floor became 4 fully equipped service bays with state-of-the-art lifts, diagnostic equipment, and tool systems that would have made larger chain operations envious. But unlike those corporate facilities, Marcus's garage was designed with customer comfort and transparency in mind. Large windows allowed customers to observe the work being performed on their vehicles if they chose. A comfortable waiting area featured local artwork books, magazines, and complimentary coffee. A small play area in one corner ensured that parents wouldn't have to choose between car maintenance and child supervision. The second floor was converted into a combination classroom and workshop space where Marcus could offer automotive training programs for high school students, adults seeking career changes, and anyone interested in learning basic car maintenance skills. Isabella funded the purchase of training vehicles, instructional materials, and equipment that would give students hands-on experience with real-world problems. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus insisted on creating a community bulletin board where local residents could post requests for rides, offer services, share recommendations, or simply connect with neighbors. The garage would be more than a business. It would be a community hub that strengthened the social fabric of Cedar Valley. Throughout the renovation process, Isabella spent several days each week in Cedar Valley, gradually becoming a familiar presence at Murphy's Corner Café, the local grocery store, and various community events. She attended Lily's school play, helped with a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department, and even participated in the town's monthly book club discussion. The transformation was as remarkable for Isabella as it was for the building. Accustomed to environments where every interaction was filtered through calculations of power, profit, and positioning, she discovered the profound relief of being judged simply on her contributions to conversation, her willingness to help with community projects, and her genuine interest in other people's lives. "You're different here," Marcus observed one evening as they reviewed contractor reports in the garage's future office space. "Different how? More relaxed. More like the person I first met at the cafe." Isabella considered this observation. "I think this is actually who I am when I'm not performing the role of successful businesswoman. The question is whether I can maintain this authenticity when I go back to New York. Maybe the question is whether you need to go back to New York as often as you think you do. My company requires oversight strategic planning board meetings. And then you have competent people who can handle day-to-day operations while you focus on investments that actually matter to you." Isabella was quiet for a moment, contemplating possibilities she'd never seriously considered. "Are you suggesting I relocate to Cedar Valley?" "I'm suggesting you consider where you want to build your life versus where you think you're supposed to build your life." This conversation planted seeds that would grow over the following weeks as Isabella experienced the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful with her own hands, rather than simply writing checks for other people's visions. The garage's grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in early November, giving the entire community time to plan attendance and Marcus time to finalize operational procedures. Isabella had initially suggested hiring a professional event planning company, but Marcus convinced her that a small-town celebration required small-town approaches. The Cedar Valley Chamber of Commerce organized a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Local restaurants donated food for an open house. The high school marching band agreed to perform. Several community groups set up information tables to introduce themselves to visitors and demonstrate the collaborative spirit that Marcus wanted his garage to embody. The night before the opening, Marcus stood alone in his completed garage surrounded by gleaming equipment and fresh paint, hardly believing that his dreams had become tangible reality. Every tool had its designated place. Every system had been tested and optimized. Every detail reflected his commitment to excellence and service. But more than the physical transformation, Marcus was amazed by how the process had changed his understanding of what was possible when people with different resources and perspectives worked together toward shared goals. Isabella's investment had provided the capital, but her partnership had provided something equally valuable: validation that his vision was worth pursuing and expanding. A soft knock on the front door interrupted his reflection. Through the glass, he could see Isabella standing outside, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a smile that had become increasingly familiar over the past few months. "Thought you might want some company for your final inspection," she said as he unlocked the door. "Just making sure everything's ready for tomorrow." "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Marcus admitted. "What if nobody comes? What if they do come but don't like what we've built? What if I can't live up to the expectations we've created?" Isabella handed him one of the coffee cups and looked around the space with obvious pride. "Marcus, look at what you've accomplished. This isn't just a garage. It's a demonstration that business can be both profitable and principled. That success can serve community needs rather than exploiting them." "We've accomplished," Marcus corrected, None of this would exist without your investment and partnership. The vision was yours. The integrity was yours. The commitment to serving this community was yours. I just provided capital. You provided more than capital. You provided belief when I couldn't believe in myself. They stood together in comfortable silence, both contemplating the journey that had brought them to this moment and the possibilities that lay ahead. Outside Cedar Valley was settling into its quiet evening rhythm. Porch lights coming on, families gathering for dinner, the simple patterns of small-town life that neither of them had fully appreciated until they'd experienced them together. Isabella, yes, thank you for everything. Thank you for letting me be part of something that actually matters. Tomorrow would bring the formal celebration, the community recognition, and the beginning of Marcus's new chapter as a business owner. But tonight, in the quiet space they'd created together, both of them understood that they'd built something more significant than a garage. They'd built a model for how success could be measured in community impact rather than just financial returns. They'd proven that partnerships based on shared values could overcome differences in background and resources. And they discovered that sometimes the most meaningful achievements come from helping others realize their potential rather than simply accumulating personal wealth. The grand opening exceeded everyone's expectations, including those of Marcus and Isabella, who had spent weeks planning every detail. By 9 o'clock in the morning, an hour before the official ribbon-cutting ceremony, the parking lot was already filled with cars, trucks, and a surprising number of people who had walked from various neighborhoods throughout Cedar Valley. But success at this level brings visibility, and visibility brings scrutiny that neither Marcus nor Isabella had fully anticipated. The first hint of trouble came 3 weeks after the garage's triumphant opening in the form of a phone call that would test every aspect of their partnership. "Marcus, we need to talk." Isabella's voice carried a tension he'd never heard before. "Can you meet me at the cafe in an hour?" When Marcus arrived at Murphy's Corner Cafe, he found Isabella sitting at their usual table, but everything about her body language suggested this would not be their typical, comfortable conversation. She was reading something on her phone with the kind of focused intensity that indicated bad news rather than casual browsing. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked as he sat down. Isabella turned her phone toward him, displaying an article from a prominent business magazine. The headline read, "Martinez Capital's Small-Town Experiment, Philanthropy, or Tax Strategy." The article was carefully researched and devastatingly written. It outlined Isabella's investment in Marcus's garage, characterized it as either a publicity stunt or a tax avoidance scheme, and raised questions about her motivations for slumming it in Cedar Valley. The writer had interviewed several unnamed sources in the financial industry who suggested that Isabella's recent investment patterns indicated either a midlife crisis or a calculated attempt to rehabilitate her public image. But the most damaging section focused on Marcus himself. The article described him as an unsophisticated small-town mechanic who appears to have been selected more for his photogenic story than his business qualifications. Ishaya, it questioned whether someone with his limited education and experience could successfully operate a facility funded by sophisticated investment capital. "This is brutal," Marcus said after reading the entire piece. "It gets worse," Isabella replied grimly. "This article has been picked up by 3 other publications, and my company's board of directors is scheduled to meet tomorrow to discuss whether my recent investment decisions reflect sound judgment or compromised priorities." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. What does that mean for the garage? It means that if the board decides my judgment has been compromised, they might force me to divest from investments they consider frivolous or unprofessional, including our partnership. Potentially, yes. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the implications of this unexpected development. Marcus had always known that Isabella's involvement carried risks he didn't fully understand, but he'd assumed those risks were primarily financial, rather than reputational. "Is there anything we can do?" Marcus asked finally. "I can fight the board's concerns, but that might draw even more media attention to our partnership. Or I can try to minimize the controversy by stepping back from active involvement in the garage." What would stepping back mean? It could mean anything from reducing my ownership percentage to completely dissolving our partnership arrangement. Marcus felt the familiar weight of anxiety that he'd carried for years before meeting Isabella. The constant worry about financial stability, the fear that circumstances beyond his control could destroy everything he'd worked to build. But now that anxiety was complicated by deeper concerns about what this controversy might mean for Isabella and her career. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to fight for what we've built," Isabella said without hesitation. "But I need to know that you are prepared for whatever scrutiny that might bring." "What kind of scrutiny?" "Media attention, potentially intrusive questions about your background and qualifications, possible challenges to the garage's business practices by competitors who want to see us fail." Marcus thought about Lily, about the quiet life they'd built in Cedar Valley, about the community that had embraced their project with such enthusiasm. Did he have the right to expose all of that to the kind of attention that Isabella's world apparently attracted? "How bad could it get?" he asked. Isabella's expression was grave. "In my experience, there's no limit to how ugly these things can become when powerful people feel threatened by change." "Why would our garage threaten anyone?" "Because we're proving that businesses can be both profitable and ethical. That's a dangerous precedent for companies that have built their success on exploitation and corner cutting." Marcus was beginning to understand that their partnership existed within larger economic and social systems that he'd never needed to consider as an employee mechanic. The garage wasn't just a local business, it was a symbol of alternative approaches to capitalism that might make some people very uncomfortable. "I need to think about this," Marcus said finally. "Of course, but Marcus, yeah. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that building this garage with you has been the most meaningful professional experience of my life. Regardless of what happens with the media or my board of directors, I don't regret a single moment of our partnership." That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with Lily working on homework beside him, trying to process the day's revelations and their potential consequences. Everything that had felt secure and positive just 24 hours earlier now felt fragile and threatened. Lily noticed his distraction immediately. "Daddy, you look worried again." "Just thinking about work stuff, sweetheart. Is the garage lady in trouble?" Marcus was continually amazed by his daughter's ability to perceive adult concerns, even when he thought he was hiding them effectively. "She might be. Some people think she shouldn't have helped us build the garage." "That's stupid," Lily declared with 7-year-old directness. "Helping people is good." "Yes, it is. But sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be." "Are you going to help her back?" The simplicity of Lily's question cut through all of Marcus's anxiety and uncertainty. Of course he was going to help Isabella. She'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, invested in their community, when she could have chosen safer opportunities and demonstrated more integrity in 6 months than many people managed in entire careers. The question wasn't whether to support Isabella through this crisis. The question was how to do it effectively while protecting the community and family that had become so important to both of them. Marcus made his decision that night, but the opportunity to act on it came sooner than expected. The next morning, as Marcus was opening the garage for another day of routine maintenance and repair work, a television news van pulled into the parking lot. 2 reporters and a camera operator emerged, clearly preparing to film some kind of story about the garage and its controversial funding. Mr. Thompson, the lead reporter, a polished woman in her 30s, approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting cooperation through persistence. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We're doing a story about your partnership with Isabella Martinez and wondered if we could ask you a few questions." Marcus had never been interviewed by media before, but some instinct told him that this conversation could significantly impact both his and Isabella's futures. "What kind of questions?" "Just some basic information about how you met Ms. Martinez, how your partnership was established, and your response to suggestions that this garage represents a misuse of investment capital." "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by misuse." "Some financial analysts have suggested that Ms. Martinez's recent investment pattern indicates poor judgment or ulterior motives. We're trying to understand whether this garage represents a legitimate business venture or something else." Marcus felt anger building in his chest, not just at the reporter's implications, but at the entire system that would question Isabella's motives for supporting an honest business that served its community well. "Mrs. Walsh," Marcus said carefully, "I'm going to answer your questions, but first I want to make sure I understand what you're really asking about." "Of course. Are you asking whether Isabella Martinez is qualified to make investment decisions? We're asking whether this particular investment makes sense from a business perspective, and what qualifies you to evaluate business decisions made by someone who's built a multi-billion-dollar company from nothing. The reporter's confident expression faltered slightly. We're simply investigating concerns raised by industry professionals. Which industry professionals and what are their credentials compared to Mrs. Martinez's track record? Marcus was discovering that righteous anger could be an effective tool for focusing his thoughts and clarifying his positions. These people were questioning Isabella's judgment without understanding her motivations, criticizing their partnership without examining its results, and attempting to create controversy where none existed. Mr. Thompson, can you tell us about your background and qualifications for operating this facility? I've been repairing automobiles for 15 years. I've maintained a reputation for honest work and fair pricing throughout my career. I've studied automotive systems extensively through both formal training and practical experience, and I've demonstrated my commitment to this community through years of reliable service. But do you have formal business education or experience managing a facility of this size and complexity? Do you have formal journalism education or experience evaluating complex business partnerships? Marcus replied, because it seems like you're making judgments about things you don't understand. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus growing more confident in his ability to defend both his own qualifications and Isabella's integrity. By the time the news crew left, he was certain they hadn't gotten the story they'd come looking for. But he was also certain that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The news story that aired that evening was exactly as biased and sensationalized as Marcus had feared. Despite his careful answers and logical responses, the edited segment presented the garage as a vanity project funded by a billionaire with questionable judgment. Marcus was portrayed as an unqualified beneficiary of misguided philanthropy, while Isabella was depicted as either naive or calculating. The story's impact was immediate and devastating. By the next morning, Marcus had received calls from 3 customers canceling scheduled appointments. 2 potential employees who had been planning to join the garage's training program withdrew their applications. Even worse, several community members who had been enthusiastic supporters began asking questions about whether the garage represented the values they thought they were endorsing. But the most painful consequence was what the controversy did to Isabella herself. She arrived at the garage that afternoon looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something fragile and defensive that Marcus had never seen before. "My board met this morning," she said without preamble. "They're demanding that I choose between maintaining my role as CEO and continuing what they call experimental investments that compromise shareholder confidence." Marcus felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. What does that mean? It means they want me to sell my share of the garage and refocus on traditional investment strategies, or resign and lose control of the company I built. That's not fair. Fair doesn't matter in corporate governance. Perception matters. Stock prices matter. Shareholder confidence matters. Isabella sat down heavily in one of the garage's customer chairs, looking smaller and more defeated than Marcus had ever imagined possible. "I've spent 15 years building Martinez Capital into something I was proud of. I can't just walk away from all of that." "But you can walk away from this." "I might not have a choice." Marcus felt anger and helplessness warring in his chest. This woman had invested in his dreams when no one else would have treated his community with respect, and generosity had demonstrated more integrity than most people manage in entire lifetimes. And now she was being punished for those very qualities by people who measured success only in financial terms. "What if we fight this?" Marcus suggested. "What if we show them that the garage is successful, that our partnership is working, that their concerns are based on misconceptions? With what leverage they control the board, the voting shares, the corporate structure. I built the company, but I don't control it anymore. Then maybe it's time to build something new." Isabella looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe this is an opportunity to create something that doesn't answer to boards or shareholders or anyone else who doesn't understand what we're trying to accomplish." "Marcus, that's not how business works at this level. You can't just walk away from billion-dollar companies because you disagree with strategic decisions." "Why not?" "Because—" Isabella stopped, apparently unable to complete that sentence with any conviction. "Because what?" because you'll lose money, because you'll lose status, because other people won't understand, because I've worked too hard to get where I am to throw it all away for. She stopped again, this time because she realized what she'd been about to say. For what? Marcus pressed. For a garage in a small town? For a partnership with someone who doesn't have an MBA? For a community that actually values what you're trying to build? Isabella's composure finally cracked completely. I'm scared, Marcus. I've never been in a position where I had to choose between my career and my values. I've always been able to convince myself that I could have both. And now, and now I'm realizing that the business world I've been part of for so long doesn't actually want what I thought I was trying to create. They want profits without principles, growth without responsibility, success without conscience. Marcus moved closer, wanting to offer comfort, but unsure how to bridge the gap between their different worlds and perspectives. So what do you want to do? I want to protect what we've built here. I want to continue investing in businesses that actually matter. I want to wake up in the morning feeling good about how I spend my days. Then do that. It's not that simple. Why not? Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring out the garage's large windows at the quiet street where normal people were going about their normal lives without billion-dollar companies or board meetings or media controversies complicating their decisions. Because if I walk away from Martinez Capital, I lose most of my financial resources. And if I lose those resources, I can't continue investing in projects like this garage. So you're saying you need to maintain your wealth in order to use your wealth to help people. When you put it like that, it sounds absurd. Maybe because it is absurd, Isabella turned to look at him directly. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe the best way to help people isn't through billion-dollar investment strategies. Maybe it's through smaller, more direct actions that don't require corporate approval or shareholder consent. You're talking about giving up everything I've worked to build. I'm talking about building something better. But even as Marcus spoke these words, he could see in Isabella's expression that he was asking for something she might not be capable of giving. Her entire identity was wrapped up in her success as an investor, her reputation as a business leader, her ability to influence markets and industries through financial power. Asking her to walk away from all of that wasn't just asking her to change careers. It was asking her to fundamentally redefine who she was and what she believed about her own value and purpose. I need time to think, Isabella said finally. Of course. And Marcus, yeah, I'm sorry, this isn't what I wanted to happen when we started this partnership. I know. But as Isabella left the garage that afternoon, Marcus had a sinking feeling that their story was approaching an ending he wasn't prepared for. The forces that were pulling Isabella back toward her old world seemed stronger than the connections that were keeping her in Cedar Valley. That night, for the first time in months, Marcus went to bed feeling like he was once again facing an uncertain future alone. The end came 2 weeks later, not with a dramatic confrontation or emotional goodbye, but with a phone call that felt like a door closing, softly but permanently. Marcus, Isabella's voice sounded tired and distant. I wanted to let you know that I've reached an agreement with my board of directors. What kind of agreement? I'm selling my ownership stake in the garage back to you at cost. My lawyers are preparing the paperwork to transfer full ownership and control to you personally. Marcus felt something cold spreading through his chest. What does that mean for you? It means I maintain my position as CEO of Martinez Capital and refocus on investment strategies that don't generate controversy or media attention. And what does it mean for us? Isabella was quiet for so long that Marcus began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It means that our partnership was one of the best things that ever happened to me, but I'm not strong enough to protect it against the forces that want to destroy it. Isabella, you'll be fine, Marcus. Better than fine. You'll build exactly the kind of garage you always dreamed of, and you'll serve your community with the integrity and commitment that made me want to partner with you in the first place. But you won't be part of it. I can't be part of it. Not anymore. The conversation ended with polite wishes for future success and promises to stay in touch that both of them knew would never be fulfilled. When Marcus hung up the phone, he felt like he'd lost something far more valuable than a business partner. He'd lost a friend, a collaborator, and possibly the only person who had ever understood both his dreams and his values well enough to help him achieve them. The garage continued to operate successfully, serving the Cedar Valley community with exactly the kind of honest, fair service that Marcus had always envisioned. But every day, as he worked on cars and trained young mechanics and solved problems for customers who trusted him to treat them fairly, Marcus felt the absence of the person who had made it all possible. Isabella Martinez had given him more than capital and business expertise. She'd given him confidence validation and a broader vision of what success could look like when it was measured in community impact rather than personal gain. And now she was gone, pulled back into a world that valued her financial assets more than her moral convictions, leaving Marcus to wonder whether their partnership had been real or just a brief interruption in both their predetermined paths. 3 months passed in a routine that felt both familiar and hollow. Marcus ran his garage with the competence and integrity that had attracted Isabella's attention in the first place, but the joy and excitement of building something meaningful had been replaced by the mechanical satisfaction of simply doing good work. Lily noticed the change immediately and persistently. "You're sad again, Daddy," she observed during one of their evening homework sessions. "Like you were sad before the garage lady came." "I'm not sad, sweetheart, just tired." "You miss her." It wasn't a question, and Marcus didn't try to pretend otherwise. "Yeah, I do." "Why don't you call her?" "It's complicated, Lily. Sometimes adults have to make choices that hurt people they care about." "That's stupid." Marcus smiled despite his melancholy. "Yeah, it is pretty stupid." But Lily's observations stayed with him over the following weeks, voicing with his own growing realization that he'd let fear and pride prevent him from fighting for something that mattered more than business partnerships or investment strategies. Isabella had chosen her career over their collaboration, but Marcus had let her make that choice without offering alternatives, without fighting for possibilities that neither of them had fully explored, without acknowledging that some things were worth more than financial security or professional reputation. The revelation came during an unexpected conversation with an equally unexpected source. Pete Peterson, the elderly former hardware store owner who had sold them the building, stopped by the garage on a Thursday afternoon to check on Marcus's progress and share some observations that had been developing over several months of watching the community's response to the garage. "You know," Pete said, settling into one of the customer waiting area chairs with the deliberate movements of someone whose joints had earned the right to protest. "This place has become exactly what I hoped it would when I sold you the building." "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. But you don't seem as happy about it as I expected you'd be." Marcus paused in his organizational activities, realizing that Pete's comment had hit closer to home than he was comfortable acknowledging. "The garage is successful. The community seems satisfied with our service. I'm making a decent living. What more should I want? Maybe the same thing you wanted 6 months ago when you and that Martinez woman were planning this place together. That partnership didn't work out. Because she chose her money over your friendship, or because you were both too scared to fight for something that mattered more than either of your individual careers." Pete's directness caught Marcus off guard. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking." "I'm asking whether you gave up on her as easily as she gave up on this community. She's the one who walked away, and you're the one who let her walk away without offering her any reason to stay." Marcus set down the wrench he'd been holding and looked directly at Pete. "What reason could I have offered? I'm a small-town mechanic. She's a billionaire. We live in completely different worlds." "Do you care?" "Of course we do." Pete was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus with the kind of attention that made him feel like he was missing something obvious and important. "Marcus, in all the time I've been watching people in this town, I've never seen anyone change the way that woman changed during the months she was here." "What do you mean?" "I mean, she went from being a stranger passing through to being someone who belonged here. She made friends join the book club, helped with community events, treated everyone like neighbors instead of like whatever billionaires usually treat people like." Marcus hadn't really considered Isabella's experience from this perspective. He'd been so focused on the business aspects of their partnership that he'd missed the personal transformation Pete was describing. "You think she was happy here?" "I think she was more herself here than she'd been anywhere else in years." And I think losing that probably hurt her as much as losing the business partnership hurt you. But she chose to leave. Did she choose to leave, or did she feel like she had to leave because staying would require sacrifices that nobody was willing to help her figure out how to make? Pete's question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering unnoticed for months. Marcus began to replay conversations and interactions from their time together, looking for clues he might have missed about Isabella's internal struggles and the forces that had ultimately pulled her away from Cedar Valley. What are you suggesting I should have done differently? I'm suggesting maybe it's not too late to do something different now. Like what? Like telling her that some things matter more than money or career success. Like fighting for a friendship that brought out the best in both of you. Like giving her a reason to believe that choosing happiness over wealth might not be the craziest decision she could make. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table long after Lily had gone to bed, thinking about Pete's words and his own assumptions about what had ended his partnership with Isabella. He'd accepted her departure as inevitable, the predictable result of different priorities and incompatible worlds. But maybe the real problem had been his failure to imagine alternatives that neither of them had considered. What if Isabella's choice hadn't been between her career and their partnership? What if it had been between the safety of the familiar and the risk of building something entirely new? And what if Marcus had been so focused on protecting himself from disappointment that he'd never offered to share that risk with her? The more he thought about it, the more Marcus realized that he'd let Isabella make the hardest decision of her life completely alone, without support, without alternatives, without any indication that their partnership meant as much to him as it apparently meant to her. He'd been so afraid of being hurt that he'd never told her how much he valued not just her investment, but her friendship, her perspective, her presence in his and Lily's life. He'd never suggested that maybe success could be measured in terms other than financial returns or professional recognition. Most importantly, he'd never asked her what she actually wanted as opposed to what she felt obligated to choose. Marcus made a decision that night that required more courage than he'd needed for any business venture or personal challenge he'd ever faced. He was going to New York to have a conversation that should have happened 3 months earlier. The trip to New York was Marcus's first time traveling farther than the state capital, and everything about the experience reinforced how different his world was from Isabella's. The flight, the taxi ride through traffic that moved faster than he was comfortable with, the skyscrapers that made him feel simultaneously amazed and insignificant. All of it reminded him why he'd never seriously considered that he and Isabella could bridge the gap between their different lives. But Pete Peterson's words kept echoing in his mind: some things matter more than money or career success. And Lily's simple wisdom from months earlier: maybe you closed your heart first. Martinez Capital Management occupied 3 floors of a building that was taller than any structure Marcus had ever been inside. The lobby was all marble and polished steel, designed to impress visitors with the wealth and power of the companies housed within. Everything about the environment suggested that personal relationships were secondary to professional efficiency. Marcus had called ahead, but only to confirm that Isabella would be in the office that day. He hadn't made an appointment or explained his reasons for visiting. Some conversations were too important to be scheduled or scripted. "Mr. Thompson," the receptionist said with polished politeness when he identified himself. "Ms. Martinez is in meetings most of the day, but I can see if she has a few minutes to speak with you." Marcus waited in a conference room that was larger than his garage's customer waiting area, surrounded by awards and photographs that documented Isabella's professional achievements. Looking at these displays of success, he began to understand more clearly what she'd been afraid of losing when their partnership became controversial. But he also noticed what was missing from these carefully curated displays of professional accomplishment. There were no personal photographs, no mementos from travels or experiences outside of business contexts, no evidence of the person he'd gotten to know during their months in Cedar Valley. Marcus. He turned to find Isabella standing in the doorway, looking exactly like the polished professional from the magazine articles he'd read months earlier. Expensive suit, perfect hair, composed expression that revealed nothing about her emotional state. But her eyes showed surprised confusion and something that might have been hope. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," Marcus said, "but there are some things I should have said 3 months ago, and I was hoping you might have time to hear them now." Isabella glanced at her watch, then at the door behind her, where the sounds of a busy office continued unabated. I have about 20 minutes before my next meeting. That should be enough. She sat down across from him at the polished conference table, maintaining the professional demeanor that was probably second nature in this environment. But Marcus could see traces of the person he'd known in Cedar Valley. The vulnerability in her eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was working harder than usual to maintain her composure. "How's the garage?" she asked. "Successful? Profitable? Serving the community exactly the way we planned?" "That's wonderful. I'm glad everything worked out." "Everything didn't work out, Isabella. That's why I'm here." She was quiet, waiting for him to continue. "I let you walk away 3 months ago because I was scared of making your situation more complicated than it already was. But I've realized that I made the wrong choice." "Marcus, let me finish, please." She nodded. "I never told you how much our partnership meant to me. Not just the business aspects, but the friendship. The way you challenged me to think bigger, dream harder, believe that I was capable of more than I'd imagined." Isabella's professional composure was beginning to show small cracks. "I never told you that the months we spent building the garage together were some of the happiest I'd experienced since Sarah died. That watching you discover what it felt like to be part of a real community was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever witnessed." "Marcus, please don't." "And I never told you that I think you are making a mistake by choosing this." He gestured around the conference room with his corporate sterility over the life you were building in Cedar Valley. Isabella's composure cracked completely then. "You don't understand the pressures I'm under, the responsibilities I have, the consequences of walking away from everything I've built." "You're right, I don't understand those pressures. But I understand what you were like when you weren't carrying them." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that in Cedar Valley you weren't Isabella Martinez, billionaire investor. You were just Isabella. Someone who laughed at bad jokes, helped with community projects, read stories to 7-year-olds, and found joy in building something that mattered." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, looking out the conference room window at the city skyline that represented everything she'd worked to achieve. "And I understand," Marcus continued, "that choosing to be just Isabella would mean giving up a lot of things that you've worked very hard to attain. It would mean giving up everything. Not everything. It would mean giving up wealth and status and power. But it might mean gaining happiness, authenticity, and relationships that aren't based on what you can do for other people. You're asking me to choose between my career and—" "I'm not asking you to choose anything. I'm telling you that if you ever decide you want something different from what you have now, there are people who would support that choice. People who value you for who you are rather than what you own." Isabella's hands were trembling slightly as she processed what Marcus was saying. "What exactly are you offering?" "I'm offering friendship without conditions, partnership without corporate oversight, and a community that would welcome you back, not because of your money, but because of the person you are when you're not performing the role of successful businesswoman." "That's not a practical proposal, Marcus. I can't just abandon my responsibilities and move to a small town." "Why not?" Because other people won't understand, because you'd lose status, because you've never considered that there might be more than one way to measure success." Isabella stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street traffic below. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is that simple. Maybe the only thing making it complicated is your fear of choosing happiness over expectations." They were interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. Isabella's assistant appeared with a reminder about her next meeting, the kind of scheduling pressure that Marcus had never experienced, but that apparently governed every moment of Isabella's professional life. "I have to go," Isabella said, her professional composure returning as quickly as it had disappeared. "I know, but Isabella, yes. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that our partnership was the best thing that happened to me in years. And if you ever want to explore what a different kind of life might look like, there's a place in Cedar Valley where you'll always be welcome." Marcus left New York that afternoon, not knowing whether his words had made any impact, but feeling like he'd finally said the things that needed to be said. He'd offered Isabella alternatives that neither of them had considered 3 months earlier, and now the choice was entirely hers to make. The flight home gave him time to reflect on his own motivations and realizations. He'd made the trip not just to fight for their partnership, but to fight for the possibility that authentic relationships could survive the pressures of different worlds and conflicting priorities. Whether Isabella would choose to explore that possibility remained to be seen. But Marcus had learned something important about himself in the process. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the outcome was uncertain. Some relationships deserved more effort than he'd initially been willing to invest. And sometimes the biggest risk was not taking any risk at all. For 2 weeks after his return from New York, Marcus heard nothing from Isabella. He tried to focus on his work, his community responsibilities, and his evening routines with Lily, but found himself checking his phone more frequently than usual and listening for unfamiliar cars in the garage parking lot. Then on a Thursday morning that began like any other, Marcus arrived at the garage to find a familiar figure sitting on the front steps with a suitcase beside her and a coffee cup in her hands. Isabella looked different than she had in the corporate conference room. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, and her expression carried a mixture of uncertainty and determination that made her appear both vulnerable and resolute. "I resign," she said without preamble as Marcus approached, "from your company, from my company, my board positions, my investment committees, and basically everything that required me to wear business suits and pretend that quarterly profits were more important than human relationships." Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate, but he tried to keep his voice calm. "And now I'm unemployed, significantly less wealthy than I was 2 weeks ago, and sitting on the steps of a garage in Cedar Valley with no idea what happens next. How do you feel about that?" Isabella's smile was the first genuine expression of joy Marcus had seen from her since their business partnership had ended. "Terrified and exhilarated and more hopeful than I've been in years." Marcus unlocked the garage door and gestured for her to come inside. "What made you decide?" "Your visit made me realize that I'd been asking myself the wrong questions. Instead of asking whether I could afford to leave my old life, I started asking whether I could afford to keep living it. And And the answer was no. I was slowly disappearing into a role that required me to ignore everything I actually cared about." They stood in the garage's main work area, surrounded by the tools and equipment that represented Marcus's dreams made tangible. Isabella looked around with obvious appreciation for what the space had become during her absence. "The place looks good," she said. "You've made some improvements." "A few. Business has been steady, community response has been positive, and I've been able to hire 2 part-time mechanics to help with the workload." "That's wonderful. I'm proud of what you've built." "We built," Marcus corrected. "This place exists because you believed in something that I was too scared to pursue on my own." Isabella was quiet for a moment, processing the emotional weight of returning to a place that represented both her greatest professional risk and her most meaningful personal experience. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." "Of course. When you came to New York, were you offering friendship or were you offering something more?" The directness of her question caught Marcus off guard, but he'd learned that Isabella deserved honesty even when it made him uncomfortable. "I was offering whatever you were ready to accept. Friendship, partnership, community, or," he paused, gathering courage, "or whatever might develop naturally between two people who care about each other and share similar values." "And what do you want?" "I want you to be happy. I want you to feel like you belong somewhere. I want you to have relationships that aren't based on what you can provide for other people. That's what you want for me. What do you want for yourself?" Marcus had spent weeks thinking about this question, but actually voicing the answer required more vulnerability than he'd anticipated. "I want someone who understands why I do this work, who shares my values about treating people fairly, who challenges me to be better than I thought I could be." He paused. "I want someone who makes me laugh, who fits into my life with Lily, who makes ordinary moments feel special just by being present for them." "And do you think I could be that person?" "Oh, I think you already were that person during the months we were building this place together." Isabella moved closer, and Marcus could see in her expression the same mixture of hope and fear that he was feeling. "I've never been in a relationship with someone who isn't from my world," she said. "I don't know how to navigate the practical aspects of building a life with someone whose background is so different from mine." "Neither do I, but maybe we could figure it out together." "It would be complicated. I still have some financial resources, which creates imbalances." You have a daughter, which means any relationship affects more than just the two of us. We'd be starting from very different places. But maybe we'd be heading toward the same place. Isabella laughed, the sound filling the garage with warmth that had been missing for months. You make it sound simple. Maybe the best things are simple. Maybe we've been overthinking something that could be as straightforward as two people who care about each other deciding to see to what they might build together. Are you asking me out, Marcus Thompson? I'm asking if you'd like to stay for dinner. Lily's been asking about you regularly, and I think she'd be excited to hear about your adventures in unemployment. I'd love to stay for dinner, but first can I ask you about something business-related? Sure. How would you feel about expanding the garage's educational programs? I've been thinking about automotive training initiatives that could serve a broader regional community. Marcus grinned. Are you asking to be my business partners again? I'm asking if you might be interested in building something even bigger than what we originally planned. Something that could demonstrate new models for community-based education and economic development. Using what resources? Mine, what's left of them anyway, plus some connections I've maintained with people who care more about social impact than financial returns. You'd want to invest in the garage again? I'd want to invest in us again, in the vision we shared, the community we were serving, and the possibility that business can be a force for good rather than just a mechanism for accumulating wealth. Marcus looked around the garage, imagining what it might become with expanded resources and Isabella's strategic expertise. But more importantly, he imagined what his life might become with Isabella as a permanent partner in every sense of the word. There's one condition, he said. What's that? This time we do it as equals. Same ownership percentage, same decision-making authority, same responsibility for success or failure. Even though I'm providing most of the capital, especially because you're providing most of the capital, I don't want there to be any question about whether this partnership is based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. Isabella extended her hand with a smile that promised both business success and personal happiness. Deal. As they shook hands in the garage that had brought them together, both Marcus and Isabella understood that they were committing to much more than a business arrangement. They were choosing to build a life together based on shared values, mutual support, and the radical belief that success should be measured in community impact rather than personal accumulation. The expanded garage project took shape over the following months with an efficiency that surprised everyone involved, including Marcus and Isabella themselves. Working together as true partners rather than investor and recipient, they discovered that their different perspectives and skill sets created a synergy that made every aspect of the venture more effective. Isabella's business experience and strategic thinking combined with Marcus's operational expertise and community connections to create programming that served real needs in innovative ways. They established partnerships with local high schools to offer automotive training as part of regular curriculum. They created apprenticeship programs that provided pathways to stable employment for young adults who couldn't afford traditional college education. But perhaps most importantly, they developed the garage as a community hub that offered much more than automotive services. Tool lending libraries for residents who couldn't afford to purchase equipment, basic car maintenance workshops for anyone interested in learning to care for their own vehicles, meeting space for community organizations that needed gathering places. The personal relationship that developed alongside their professional partnership was equally successful, though it required patience and communication from both of them as they learned to navigate the complexities of blending their very different backgrounds. Lily was instrumental in helping them find their rhythm as a family unit. Her acceptance of Isabella was immediate and unconditional, and her suggestions for family activities often provided the perfect bridge between Marcus's small-town preferences and Isabella's broader cultural interest. Can we go to the art museum in the city? Lily asked one Saturday morning as they planned weekend activities. That sounds fun, Isabella replied. And maybe afterward we could stop by that farmer's market Marcus mentioned. And then can we come home and work on my treehouse? Absolutely, Marcus said, appreciating how naturally they'd learned to combine different types of experiences into days that satisfied everyone's interests. The integration wasn't always smooth. Isabella struggled with the slower pace of small-town life, missing the intellectual stimulation and cultural resources she'd taken for granted in New York. Marcus sometimes felt overwhelmed by Isabella's energy and ambition, wondering whether his more modest dreams were sufficient to sustain her interest over time. But they learned to address these tensions through honest communication and creative problem-solving. Isabella arranged for guest speakers and cultural events that brought outside perspectives to Cedar Valley. Marcus encouraged Isabella to maintain connections with former colleagues who shared her values, creating opportunities for intellectual engagement that didn't require returning to corporate life. Most importantly, they both discovered that love didn't require them to become different people, but rather to become the best versions of who they already were. 6 months after Isabella's return to Cedar Valley, they were approached by a delegation from 3 neighboring communities who wanted to replicate their garage model in their own towns. The request led to the establishment of the Community Enterprise Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting locally owned businesses that prioritize community service over profit maximization. This is becoming bigger than either of us imagined, Isabella observed one evening as they reviewed applications from potential partner communities. Is that good or bad? Marcus asked. It's good. It means we've created something that actually works, something that other people can adapt to their own communities and circumstances. And it means you get to travel, again, work with different communities, stay intellectually challenged. While coming home to Cedar Valley every week, Isabella added, to you and Lily and the life we're building together. Marcus smiled. Best of both worlds. Better than I ever thought possible. As they worked side by side that evening, planning expansion strategies and reviewing community applications, both Marcus and Isabella reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this point. A chance encounter in a small-town cafe had evolved into a business partnership, which had survived crisis and separation to become a personal relationship, which had generated a model for community development that was spreading beyond anything they'd originally envisioned. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned that success didn't require choosing between personal happiness and professional achievement. When built on authentic values and genuine relationships, both were not only possible but mutually reinforcing. The garage that had started as Marcus's dream and been enabled by Isabella's resources had become something entirely new, a demonstration that business could serve community needs, that relationships could bridge different worlds, and that sometimes the most important changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness. 2 years after Isabella's return to Cedar Valley, the Thompson-Martinez Community Garage had become a model that was being studied and replicated across the country. Universities sent students to observe their training programs. Government agencies consulted with them about rural economic development strategies. Business schools used their partnership as a case study in values-based entrepreneurship. But the most meaningful measure of their success was visible every day in the ordinary interactions that filled the garage with life and purpose. Mr. Marcus called Jenny Patterson, a 17-year-old who was halfway through the garage's automotive training program. I got accepted to the State University's engineering program, and they're giving me credit for the coursework I've completed here. That's fantastic, Jenny, Marcus replied, feeling the pride that came from watching young people discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. When do you start? Fall semester. But I was wondering if I could keep working here part-time during school breaks to stay connected with hands-on work while I'm studying theory. We'd love to have you back whenever you're available. Conversations like this happen regularly now. Young people who had entered the garage's programs with limited options were graduating with technical skills, academic opportunities, and the confidence that came from meaningful work experience. Many went on to college or specialized training programs. Others started their own automotive businesses or joined established companies with the expertise and work ethic they developed in Cedar Valley. But perhaps equally important were the relationships and community connections that the garage had facilitated for people of all ages. Isabella called Ruth Morrison, an elderly woman who had become a regular volunteer. The tool lending library needs to be restocked. We've had 12 families check out basic repair equipment this week. That's wonderful, Isabella replied. Are people finding the tools they need, or should we consider expanding our inventory? Mostly yes, but several people have asked about gardening equipment now that spring is here. Let's look into that. Community gardens seem like a natural extension of what we're already doing. The tool lending library had been one of their most successful innovations, a simple idea that allowed community members to borrow equipment for home projects without the expense of purchasing tools they might only use occasionally. but it had evolved into something much larger, a resource-sharing network that strengthened neighborhood connections and reduced economic barriers to home maintenance and improvement. Similar expansions had happened organically throughout their programs. The basic automotive training had grown to include small engine repair, which served the needs of local farmers and gardeners. The community meeting space had become a hub for civic organizations, book clubs, and informal gatherings that brought people together across traditional social divisions. Most remarkably, the garage had become a place where economic differences mattered less than willingness to contribute and learn. Isabella's background and resources were acknowledged but not emphasized. Marcus's expertise was respected without being intimidating. Community members participated based on their interests and availability rather than their ability to pay for services. "You know what I love most about this place?" Isabella said to Marcus one evening as they locked up the garage after a particularly busy day. "What's that?" "It's exactly what you envisioned in that first morning we talked about your dreams. A place where people are treated fairly, where work is done with integrity, where community needs are prioritized over profit margins. But bigger than I ever imagined it could become, because you were willing to dream beyond what seemed immediately possible." They walked hand in hand toward Marcus's car, where Lily was waiting with homework spread across the back seat and opinions about where they should go for dinner. The evening routine had become comfortably familiar over the past 2 years. Garage work followed by family time, community responsibilities, balanced with personal relationships, individual goals, integrated with shared values. "Daddy," Lily called as they approached the car, "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if we can help her set up a bicycle repair workshop next month." "What kind of help does she need?" Marcus asked. "Someone to teach people how to fix their bikes and maybe someone to help organize the tools and stuff." Isabella and Marcus exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of community-initiated expansion that they'd learned to embrace rather than control. When residents identified needs and proposed solutions, the garage's role was to provide support and resources rather than oversight and direction. "Tell Mrs. Rodriguez we'd be happy to help however we can," Isabella said, "and ask her if she wants to come by this weekend to discuss details." As they drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Valley, Marcus reflected on how different his life had become from what he'd expected 2 years earlier. He'd gained not just a successful business and financial security, but a partner who challenged him to think bigger, a community role that felt meaningful, and a sense of purpose that extended far beyond individual achievement. "Isabella," he said as they pulled into their driveway, the house they'd bought together 6 months earlier, large enough for Lily to have her own room and Isabella to have office space but modest enough to feel like home rather than a display of wealth. "Yes. Do you ever miss your old life, the excitement, the puer-bien, the sense that you were operating at the center of important events?" Isabella considered the question as they gathered Lily's school materials and prepared to transition from work mode to family mode. "I miss the intellectual challenge sometimes and the feeling that I was influencing large-scale change. But I don't miss the isolation, the constant calculation of relationships, or the sense that my success was measured entirely in financial terms." "And what do you like most about this life?" "The authenticity, the relationships that aren't based on what I can provide for other people, the opportunity to see the direct impact of the work we're doing." She paused, looking at the house that had become their shared home, with Lily's bicycle on the front porch and the herb garden Isabella had planted along the walkway. "And I like waking up every morning knowing that the day will be spent on things that actually matter to me." That evening, after Lily had finished her homework and gone to bed, Marcus and Isabella sat on their back porch with glasses of wine and the comfortable silence that comes from knowing someone well enough to not need constant conversation. "I've been thinking about the future," Isabella said eventually. "What about it?" "About whether we want to expand the community enterprise network more aggressively or focus on deepening the programs we already have established." "What do you think?" "I think we should let community need drive our decisions rather than trying to impose growth strategies that might not serve real purposes." Marcus nodded. "That's always been your strength, understanding when to push and when to let things develop naturally. And your strength has been understanding what actually works in practice rather than just in theory." They'd learned over their 2 years of partnership that their different perspectives and skills created better outcomes than either could achieve individually. Isabella's strategic thinking and resource development combined with Marcus's operational expertise and community insight to create programming that was both innovative and practical. But more importantly, they'd learned to balance their professional collaboration with their personal relationship in ways that strengthen both rather than creating competition or conflict. Marcus, yeah, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. Okay. Isabella set down her wine glass and turned to face him directly. How would you feel about getting married? The question caught Marcus completely off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. They'd been living together for 6 months, sharing financial responsibilities and parenting duties and long-term planning decisions. Marriage was a logical next step rather than a radical departure. I'd like that, he said after a moment. Very much. Even though it would mean legally joining your life to someone who comes from a completely different background. Especially because of that. I like that our different perspectives make us both stronger. And even though it would mean Lily gaining a stepmother who's still learning how to be any kind of mother at all, Isabella, you've been more of a mother to Lily over the past 2 years than many biological parents manage to be. She adores you, trusts you, and has learned more about confidence and possibility from watching you than I could have taught her alone. Isabella's smile was soft and genuine. I love you, Marcus Thompson. I love your integrity, your commitment to doing right by people, your willingness to dream big and work hard to make those dreams reality. I love you too, Isabella Martinez. I love your intelligence, your generosity, your refusal to accept that business has to be heartless or that success has to come at other people's expense. They kissed on their back porch as the sun set over Cedar Valley, surrounded by the life they'd built together and the community they'd chosen to serve. In the distance, they could see the lights of the garage where their partnership had begun, now expanded into something that served hundreds of people and was inspiring similar projects across the country. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned that the most important success wasn't measured in financial returns or professional recognition, but in the daily satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships that enriched rather than depleted, and the knowledge that their choices were making the world a little bit better for the people around them. The wedding took place 6 months later in the garage itself. It's surrounded by the community that had embraced both of them and supported the vision they'd built together. Lily served as both flower girl and ring bearer, declaring herself the most important person in the wedding since she'd been the one to ask when they were going to make it official. Pete Peterson, now 81, and still offering unsolicited wisdom to anyone willing to listen, served as officiant after getting ordained online specifically for the occasion. I've seen a lot of partnerships in my time, he told the assembled crowd, but I've never seen two people who brought out the best in each other the way these two do. The celebration that followed featured food from every restaurant in Cedar Valley, music from the high school jazz band, and dancing that continued until well past the time when most of the older attendees needed to go home. But Marcus and Isabella barely noticed the party details, focused instead on the faces of friends and neighbors who had become family, young people whose futures had been changed by the opportunities they'd created, and community members who had found ways to contribute and connect through the programs they'd established. As the evening wound down and they stood together in the garage that had brought them together, surrounded by the tools and equipment that represented both practical work and impossible dreams made real, Marcus and Isabella reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. No regrets, Marcus asked. None whatsoever, Isabella replied. This is exactly the life I never knew I wanted. Even though it's completely different from what you thought success looked like. Because it's completely different from what I thought success looked like. They locked up the garage together, turning off lights and securing equipment that would be put to good use again tomorrow, serving people who deserved honest work at fair prices. As they walked toward their car, passing the tool lending library and the community bulletin board and the classroom where tomorrow's session would teach teenagers to diagnose engine problems, both of them understood that they'd achieved something more valuable than wealth or status or professional recognition. They'd built a life together based on shared values, meaningful work, and authentic relationships. They'd created a business that served community needs rather than exploiting them. They demonstrated that success could be measured in terms of impact rather than accumulation. And they'd proven that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness. A cup of coffee offered to a stranger, a conversation between people from different worlds, and the revolutionary belief that everyone deserves to be seen and valued for who they are rather than what they own. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Thompson?" Marcus asked as they reached their car. "Ready for anything, Mr. Thompson," Isabella replied. And as they drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Valley toward the home they'd chosen to build together, both of them knew that their story was far from over. They'd created something that would continue to grow and serve and inspire long after they were gone, something that honored the best of what both of them had brought to their unlikely partnership. But perhaps most importantly, they'd learned that the most meaningful success comes not from achieving individual dreams, but from helping other people discover and pursue dreams they never knew they had. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find someone who wants to spend their life doing that work alongside you. The garage lights went dark, but the impact of what Marcus and Isabella had built together would continue to illuminate their community and countless others for years to come. Because the best stories don't really end. They inspire new chapters that other people write with their own courage, creativity, and commitment to making the world a little bit better than they found it. And sometimes it all begins with a $3 cup of coffee and the simple decision to treat a stranger with kindness.